Chapter 706. After experiencing the attack and defense of the chess pieces, Liu Xiaoyi roughly understood some of the specific rules of the cultivator's chess game. This was probably a combination of the rules of chess and the cultivator's principles. There were many variables in it. First of all, the attacker had the right to make the first move. Just like what he experienced just now, before he made his move, the defender could not make the first move. This meant that the attacker had control of the rhythm and opening of the attack. For example, if Liu Xiaoyi chose close combat, the red soldiers could only do so. This had a great impact on the battle between cultivators. It was beneficial for the attacker to maximize his advantage. Second, the defender could not escape. He could only respond to the attacker's attack within a certain range, which was to the left of the flag. After enduring the opponent's first attack, both sides began to enter a state of balance. At this point, the attacker had no advantage to use. It depended on how much the attacker could expand his advantage in the opening. Third, the attacker had the right to make the first move. However, this was also a double-edged sword. Once the attack began, it was not allowed to stop. He could not say that if he could not attack for the time being, he could retreat to take a breather and attack again. Once the attack began, he could not stop. Finally, if he won, he had the right to suggest the next move. Of course, whether he listened or not depended on the commander. This was a chess game that everyone was participating in. It was not like what he had imagined, where it was purely cannon fodder. It wasn't right to use the Go playbook from his previous life to judge Wang Xian. He thought that Wang Xian was a terrible Go player, but in fact, Wang Xian had to consider many more things, including the momentum, the distribution of the Go force, and the evaluation of the strength of his own Go pieces. Wang Xian needed a very comprehensive consideration to decide the next Go move. It wasn't just a game of Go where Wang Xian pointed the way. The chess records were like this, but if the chess pieces could not kill the opponent, it was useless. The opponent had a flying elephant. Liu Xiaoyi sadly realized that he was under the elephant's foot. At any time, the elephant's leg was hanging above his head. He was still a law cultivator. This was also the ruling orthodoxy in the upper realm of Zhou. However, as for the specific situation, what he was good at, his fighting habits, whether he liked to use forbidden spells or instant spells, whether he liked to attack from afar or close combat. He did not know anything. He could only be prepared to be stepped on. This time, someone else would definitely attack first. As a pawn, his legs were too short to reach them. Next, the white brows took good care of him. In order to prevent him from being trampled by the elephant, a surge of power surged, and he moved forward another step. He felt that he had already fallen into a red sea. Liu Xiaoyi almost cursed it out loud. Can't he move to the left or right? Must he charge forward? You're only 16 feet tall, and you're eyeing me? The so-called chess game was, of course, to arrange the overall situation. The chess pieces had to be used with all their might, maintaining a three-dimensional attack path, forming a balanced situation, and then finding an opportunity to kill. Who would catch a sheep and pull it with all their might? The white-haired man only recognized him as a pawn, and so did that old freak Jean. You're just a F***king pawn? Why are you in such a hurry? Did he have to eat it to feel better? Old Monster Jin's next move left him completely speechless. Old Monster Jean vaulted. Well, Liu Xiaoyi had just escaped from the elephant's leg, and now he was running down the horse's leg. He finally understood and was no longer in a hurry. No matter who it was, he would just have to be prepared to deal with the other's critical strike. Fortunately, the horse's leg did not step down for the time being. The two Supremes finally began to move at a normal pace and began to deploy troops on the other side, arranging the layers. Liu Xiaoyi was temporarily forgotten. As the battle progressed, everyone began to mobilize their forces. In a narrow chess game, close combat was unavoidable. Both sides had their gains, and it was hard to tell who was the winner. What should be eaten was not eaten, and what should not be eaten was swallowed. It was a mess, and it was a complete mess. One could no longer look at this game from the perspective of chess. In such a chaotic situation, Liu Xiaoyi was unexpectedly not attacked, nor was he moved around by the white brows. It was as if the white brows did not see this pawn. Only Lu Xiaoyi could feel the pressure on him increasing, because he was not only under the horse's leg, but also under the cannon's muzzle, and also in the middle of the road. He was in a state of being surrounded and attacked. This made him acutely aware of the way to attack and defend on the chessboard. A chess piece like him, who was under the enemy's firepower, was almost an inevitable target for the enemy. This was different from a real chess game. Here, one had to consider the problem of exhaustion. Under the range of multiple attacks, it meant that he could be attacked consecutively, and at most, there would only be one round of rest between each attack. This was a huge challenge to his magical power foundation. After adding the element of cultivation into a chess game, the things that one had to consider were beyond the level of chess. Move your father to the side a little. Lu Xiaoyi wanted to shout, but he knew that it was meaningless. If he shouted, it might spoil the situation. The White Brows deployed troops on the other side and arranged a large number of troops. Obviously, he was using him as a pawn to attract the enemy's firepower. The mission was very important. He was in charge of blocking and attacking. A pawn was carrying a person, a carriage, a horse, and a cannon, while a black cannon was behind him. It seemed that as long as the red piece ate him, it would consume a lot of energy. Then, the black cannon could take advantage of the situation. This was a brilliant strategy. It meant that whoever made the first move would either die or face 2 consecutive rounds. This was a glorious mission. What grudge? What grudge? The pawn was a little crowded. He had considered the worst-case scenario. The White Brows would use him to eat the red horse next to him. If he succeeded, the red cannon would hit him. If he could hold on this time, the White Brows would use him to push the elephant, and then he would be pierced by the chariot. If he could hold on until then, the White Brows would be able to attack Hong Shi again. 3 consecutive rounds, 5 consecutive rounds, or even 7 rounds. It couldn't be, right? The black side suffered a great loss on the other side. After 2 consecutive pawns, it was counterattacked. With so many troops, it became a stalemate in the end. This meant that the White Brows had a problem with the use of pawns. The red team had suffered a small loss in the beginning of the battle, but they were able to regain their advantage in terms of offense and defense. So far, the red team still had 9 members, while the black team only had 8. Both Bai Mei and Jean turned their attention back to the side where the battle started. Since they couldn't decide the outcome of the battle from the main battlefield, they could only settle it from the side battlefield. This was from the perspective of a chess game. From the perspective of a cultivator, 15 cultivators had died in battle. There was no retreat due to injuries. In the upper realm of Zhou Xian, the cruelty of the cultivation world had not changed at all. It had nothing to do with immortals. In front of Lu Xiaoyi, he could clearly feel the power of the red side. Shuangshi, afterimage, 1 chariot, 1 cannon, 2 horses, and maybe a broken soldier. The red side was already preparing to attack the black side's nest. But before that, they had to deal with a guy who could raise the chariot in 3 moves. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly realized that his previous thinking was wrong. He was still using the rules of chess. He always thought about eating and eating. In fact, there was a simple way, which was to let the black pawn advance. In the end, he could get some unexpected benefits by raising the chariot. He was still 3 moves away. If the black side moved first, he would only need 4 rounds to reach the end. Chapter 707. Author's note. Happy Singles Day. Sloth will update for my friends. Do you want Sloth to be happy when you are done with it? He guessed right. There was no red piece in front of him, so Bai Mei did not hesitate to let him take a step forward. His intention was obvious. This position was also the horse's leg, cannon hole, and chariot path. The question was who would kill him. His judgment was that the horse would step on him, because the horse's step was such an opportunity. If he took another step forward, the horse would not be able to kick him, and the cannon and chariot path were still there. In the previous intense battle, Lu Xiaoyi had been observing the foundation of these people and their habits of attacking, especially those who could possibly take care of him. Not everyone had made a move before, but this horse had. It was a body cultivator. Its body was extremely strong. The horse was moved to Lu Xiaoyi's side to counter his strong close combat ability. From this, one could see the old monster Jin's ability to control the game. After most of the pieces from both sides had displayed their abilities, the essence of the game was to coordinate the entire battle and use the most suitable person to deal with the most suitable opponent. This was also the key to victory in the game. The use of the pieces tested the foresight of the commander. Body cultivator, close combat. Why did they think that a body cultivator would be able to defeat the swordsman in close combat? Or was there another reason? The red horse cultivator was already flying towards him. At this moment, Lu Xiaoyi could clearly feel that his room to maneuver was only within 100 feet of the black flag. In such a narrow space, he could not use his sword at all. He drew his sword. A few hundred feet of space was enough for him to use his close combat sword techniques. This was a close combat that all the cultivators around had expected. The red horse galloped through the clouds with a majestic aura. The Dharma idol grew continuously as it flew, and with a deafening roar, it was squeezing out all of its potential, playing life and death with the swordsman in close combat. Even if he had a Dharma idol, he was not that stupid. He was very clear that the swordsman had displayed terrifying close combat sword techniques when he killed the red soldier. Even if he won, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. Hence, the way he entered the game was very important. He directly entered the battle, and both sides suffered great losses. It needed to use its divine ability before entering the game to establish the cornerstone of its victory. He was very familiar with the swordsman and had fought against him several times. He knew that there was a blind spot in the swordsman's attack. This was the initial acceleration stage from 1,000 feet to 1,000 feet. Different swordsmen had different values. This was a swordsman's secret. This blind spot was especially serious among Jin Dan's swordsmen. In the foundation establishment stage, the speed of the sword was relatively slow, so there was no blind spot. In the Yuanying stage, the cultivator's Dao realm was almost negligible. Only Jin Dan's swordsman did not have Dao realm, but his flying sword was extremely fast. This caused the sword disc to be difficult to control for a short distance. It was a blind spot. In a blind spot, the swordsman's flying sword was the easiest to dodge. Because it was difficult to control one's divine sense, the swordsman would usually focus his energy on accelerating his flying sword to its maximum speed. Acceleration and control were a pair of contradictory entities. His tactic was to use his divine ability when he was close to the swordsman's blind spot. At this time, the swordsman would definitely attack with his flying sword if he saw him attacking first. Attacking was a swordsman's nature. There was no other possibility. Because the distance between them was very close, the swordsman would not be able to dodge his divine ability within a limited range. However, he could easily dodge the flying sword in the blind spot. When he closed in, the swordsman would already be a swordsman who had been hit by a divine ability. His battle prowess would be greatly reduced. Naturally, he would not be a match for a physique cultivator who was equally strong in close combat. This tactic could not be used in the wild because the swordsman would not give him the chance to get close to the blind spot. However, it was perfect in the heaven and earth chessboard because the passive side would not be able to attack him first. This was the safest tactic. It would prevent both sides from getting injured in such a small space. Everything was going according to plan. The swordsman pulled out his sword. His entire body glowed with a defensive brilliance as he waited for a close combat. This was good news. Such a move would at least slow down his opponent's reaction. After he used his divine ability, even a split second of delay could affect the final outcome. The avatar's aura became even more majestic. Its four hands are holding an axe, a hammer, a knife, and a fork respectively. If it really wanted to close in on its opponent, it would not be something that an ordinary person could withstand. This was also a facade to force the opponent to be wary of close combat. When you see a giant over 10 feet tall wielding four terrifying weapons, anyone would have the same reaction. At 4,000 feet, the red horse took into consideration that its speed would give it an advantage. Thus, it activated its special divine ability. The cry of the azure ape. In ancient times, the azure ape would cry while facing a river. Those who heard it would feel weak and their limbs would go limp. In fact, it was a strange form of shock waves in the human body. At the cost of the body cultivator's own muscles and muscles, it would cause the opponent's muscles and muscles to resonate with it. The body cultivator was already familiar with this kind of rhythm. It did not affect them at all. However, the opponent would lose control of their own body because of this unfamiliar rhythm. Although their transcendence, energy, and soul were normal, their limbs would not listen to them. Not only would they feel weak and limp, they would also lose control of their bodies. One could imagine the consequences of such a physical condition in the upcoming close combat. The key point was that the cry of the azure ape was a divine ability that was continuously activated. As long as the body cultivator did not stop, the rhythm would not stop until the opponent lost control of his body and was smashed into meat paste. It was a very specific supernatural power. The red horse could predict the reaction of the sword cultivator after it charged in. How many times could the sword cultivator block the attack of the four weapons? However, in the world of cultivation, perfection and accidents were often symbiotic. Just as he activated his divine ability, the black pawn flag let out a sword cry, and the flying sword suddenly shot out. There was only a moment's difference between the first and the second. If one did not look carefully, it would seem as if the two attacks were launched at the same time. This kind of reaction had already exceeded the limits of what a human should be able to do. It was clearly a prepared attack. It was not a reaction after completely sensing the arrival of the divine ability. The time was too short, and the distance was too close. To the red horse, a distance of 3,000 to 4,000 feet and a few breaths of time was simply not enough to change his tactical arrangement. He could not make any adjustments because to the attacker, since the attack had already begun, it was impossible for him to stop. Seeing the light coming, the red horse knew that it was the flying sword. The red horse could only believe that he was in the blind spot of the flying sword and could not control it well. He tried his best to turn his body. His huge transcendence form made a turn at extreme speed. He was confident that the flying sword would not be able to effectively chase after him while accelerating. Then he felt a bit of pain. It instantly turned into pain all over his body. That was the pain caused by the explosion of the sharp sword aura in his body. Even the Transcendent's golden body could not stop the sword aura from wreaking havoc in his body. It was not purely because of the power. There was something else, the disorder of the 5 elements. Chapter 708. The red horse had truly turned into a red horse now. He would still try his best to fly forward. His target was the guy whose cheeks were trembling under the black pawn flag. What kind of divine ability is this? Is it giving me electrotherapy? Lu Xiaoyi couldn't control his body from trembling all over. This was a very novel feeling. His magic power was unaffected, his spirit was unaffected, but his muscles and tendons seemed to have lost control and were trembling. He was trembling so much that he couldn't even hold his sword steadily. There were countless strange techniques in the world, but this was the first time that it could cause such an effect on his body. This kind of divine ability was meaningless in the wild because he could still escape and use his sword. But in this kind of special situation, it was very dangerous. If he really let the red horse rush in, for heavy weapons would come crashing down. His sword that he couldn't even hold steady wouldn't be able to withstand it. But his rich battle experience allowed him to avoid such a dangerous situation because he was incomparably confident in his close combat skills. He didn't believe that there would be anyone who would dare to compete with him purely in front of him. This was his ability to make a living. It was something that allowed him to dominate the Gobi Desert when he was still cultivating qi. As long as someone had eyes, they wouldn't dare to compete with him in close combat. So the more powerful the red horse's Dharma idol was, the more he knew that this guy was definitely holding back something bad. Sure enough, the red horse suddenly used its divine ability when he approached. It actually attacked, so he naturally had the right to fight back. He couldn't dodge the azure ape's cry. and the red horse couldn't dodge the Four Seasons flying sword either. Trying to find his flying sword's blind spot? Dream on. He didn't have a flying sword's blind spot. Because of the sword's spirit. Because his understanding of the five elements far exceeded that of cultivators of the same realm. So, he controlled the whole process as if it was his own arm. If he really wanted to be serious, his blind spot was less than 10 feet. It was in the instant when the sword disc flew out of the top of his head and straightened the sword. And within 10 feet, Lu Xiaoyi, had a sword in his hand. Who dared to approach? The red horse could no longer hold his weapons. Those thousands of kilograms of weapons were usually like straw sticks to him. But now, he knew that he couldn't fly to the Black Pawn flag. He was captured here to atone for his sins. How many could survive in the end? This was his fate, and he shouldn't have asked for too much. Bai Mei narrowed his eyes and smiled. Old Monster Gene had planned everything, but he would never have guessed that he had such a powerful chess piece. This was also the will of the heavens. He was the Yang Spirit Lord of the Carefree Travel Team, while the Old Monster Gene was the Yang Spirit Lord of the human sect. The grudges between the two of them had a history of thousands of years. Everyone in the upper world of Zhou Xian knew about them, so there was no need to describe their past in detail. This time, the game of chess had been decided long ago. The difficult part was the choice of chess pieces. A major cultivator needed to cultivate the body and mind. One couldn't treat a cultivator's life as a joke. Therefore, he had to use a cultivator who had made a huge mistake. At their level, of course, it was impossible for them to use the Zhuji phase to gamble. If their level was too low, they would lose their dignity. They also couldn't use yuanying, because yuanying was not something they could easily control, even if they were Yang spirits. Only Jin Dan was the most suitable. Old Monster Gene proposed this game because he had more than 10 suitable Jin Dan on hand. White Brow had accepted the challenge, and in order to gather enough people, he had spent a lot of effort. The last two who returned from the space crack were suspected to be just to make up the numbers, so he couldn't care less. He didn't expect to pick up a surprise. The two of them had fought for thousands of years, and neither of them could do anything to the other. They used all kinds of unimaginable methods, which had long gone beyond the scope of a direct battle. Chess gambling was only one of them, and it was the only one. Winning or losing didn't actually determine anything. Of course, the stakes were nothing to them, but to the cultivators below, it was something. When it came to surprises, some people were willing to keep them when they encountered them, while others were more willing to use them to create even bigger surprises. White Brow belonged to the latter. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi, whose Black Pawn flag had already reached 3,000 feet, was directly pushed forward by another step. He was only one step away from sinking to the bottom. The cannon was aimed at him, and the chariot could pierce through him. He really couldn't predict these two opponents. Moreover, he hadn't seen these two people make a move. If he could survive this, the next step would naturally be the elephant. In order to stop him, the red team would very likely send out their sharpest chariot. This was Lu Xiaoyi's own speculation. Of course, it was also possible to choose the cannon and pull the chariot to the black team's camp to counterattack. But Old Monster Gene chose to ignore it. As a sun spirit, he had his own intuition. Wasting his strength on this troublesome pawn would be more effective than counterattacking the black team. Chariots and cannons were very precious to him right now, and there was no reason to not use them on the blade. As for this pawn, let him be. Arching the elephant, there were still two soldiers. This was a chess game that tested strategy, not an arena where individuals competed for the best. Lu Xiaoyi obtained a rare time to rest. He was just a pawn, so it was impossible for all the attacks and defenses to be carried out around him. He was only a focal point. Here, there were only two protagonists, White Brow and Old Monster Gene. No one else could steal the limelight. His understanding of the great cultivator gamble was still limited. He thought that he might face several consecutive tough battles, but he was thinking too much. Old Monster Gene's aerial cannon strike. Lu Xiaoyi's Black Pawn flag was only 1,000 feet high. His line of sight was low, and he could not see anything above the clouds. He could only vaguely see the flag fluttering in the wind. Now that he had defeated 2 opponents, taken 2 pawns, and risen to a height of 3,000 feet, he could understand the situation of his own base camp. When he looked back, he could not help but laugh. Who else could it be other than Qin Xian, who was the black warrior that was shot by the red cannon? You wanted me to fight to the death in front while you watch from the back and enjoy the fun? Now it's your turn. You deserve it. The battle in Qin Xian was very intense. With his strength, it was not so difficult. In terms of cultivation, he was at the late stage of Jindan, which was why he was chosen as a soldier. But his problem was that he was not sure if he could use the Yin-Yang Tiangang steps freely in the upper realm of Zhouxian. This was a secret technique that belonged to the 3 pure ones, and it was a very strong symbol of orthodoxy. Before thoroughly understanding the Tao system of the upper realm of Zhouxian, it would be very eye-catching to use it rashly. There were 2 perfected immortals here, and they were very likely to be high-level perfected immortals. Their eyes were very sharp. Therefore, he could only use more basic techniques, which were more popular. Most of the time, he had to rely on his deep cultivation and basic instantaneous techniques to fight against the enemy. It was similar to how Lu Xiaoyi could only use 1 out of 7 flying swords and had to rely on close combat. Even so, after resisting the first wave of attacks from Red Pawn, he relied on his deep understanding of Tao to gradually recover from his disadvantage. This development was within Lu Xiaoyi's expectations. After all, Qin Xian represented the top level of the 5 rings, the level of Jindan. It did not make sense that he could not even defeat the sinful Jindan from the upper realm of Zhouxian. After a moment, Qin Xian won without any suspense, and he did not hesitate to attack. In the cultivation world, no one was innocent. Chapter 709. The next step, Bai Mei did not hesitate to use Arching Elephant. Lu Xiaoyi flew in the sea of clouds, watching Red Elephant gradually become clearer in his vision. This was an old Dan, but you could not look down on him just because he was old. In the previous round of Black Fang's attack, it was this Red Elephant who had contributed greatly, stopping Black Fang's ferocious attacks. Lu Xiaoyi had observed his battles before. Similarly, he had 2 victories, but what was surprising was that both of his victories were very ordinary and unexciting. There were no dazzling consummate skills, nor were there any breathtaking tactical combinations. However, it was precisely because of this ordinariness that Lu Xiaoyi did not dare to lower his guard. Winning in an ordinary way must have something inside of it. Those who were good at fighting had no outstanding achievements. This was exactly the kind of person. Against such an opponent, he did not know how to deal with him. This was the pressure of being ordinary. Lu Xiaoyi himself had not reached such a realm. If he had 7 flying swords in his hands, he would definitely use violence to break through the ordinary. He would let his opponent live in the ordinary and die in the ordinary. However, he only had 1 sword plate now, so he was actually very ordinary. Then, he would use the ordinary against the ordinary. Tens of li away, the 4 seasons surged out, momentum, thunder. He did not hide too much as there was no need to. In the Jindan stage, force manipulation was not new at all, and sword chi thunder sound was not rare at all. If he hid everything, he was afraid that these things could only be used in the netherworld. Red Elephant's performance was as normal as always, defending honestly, with water techniques as the main focus. This was also something that old cultivators had always displayed. Because they had practiced it to the extreme, it would appear smooth and flawless, continuous, and unending. There did not seem to be any special techniques, just basic water element techniques and a few water element techniques. However, in his hands, it was as natural as breathing. His person, including the space he was standing in, seemed to be in a huge water droplet. All kinds of water element techniques were at his fingertips, as if he was the water, and the water was him. The reason why he did not choose to attack at close range was because this water element environment would slow down the speed of his sword. At the same time, his every move would be transmitted through the medium of the water, making it difficult to create that kind of incomparably fierce, killing intent. Water was formless. Softness could subdue hardness. This was not just a saying. The Four Seasons gradually lost its sharpness under the layers of Red Elephant's water spells. But what Red Elephant didn't expect was that the Four Seasons didn't retreat from its rhythm of attack. Instead, it continued to swim around the Red Elephant with the ripples of the water, slowly recovering from its reduced speed. This was not the normal trajectory of a flying sword. Under normal circumstances, when a flying sword attack was blocked, it would jump out of the surrounding environment and attack after attack, attack after attack. This would allow the flying sword to unleash its maximum speed and power with every attack. However, this was the first time he had encountered someone who refused to retreat from the attack. There was no doubt that the flying sword had regained its strength from his water-type spell technique. Using the 5 elements conversion, it was a high-end understanding of the 5 elements to convert water energy into earth energy. This was a challenge to him, a challenge to their understanding of the 5 elements. Red Elephant could not divert his attention to attack, because this would give GE's flying sword the ability to break through his water element defense. He also did not have to worry about the swordsman's other moves, because the competition in the control of the 5 elements was the key to victory. Lu Xiaoyi could accept being ordinary, but he would choose to dawdle in the direction he was good at. This was also a rare competition between Dao Realm cultivators in the Golden Core stage. The focus was on the control of 4 Seasons' 5 elements. Lu Xiaoyi's goal was to use his opponent's strong water element to try and use the 5 elements conversion to regain the power it needed to attack. Therefore, his flying sword did not retreat and kept circling around Red Elephant, maintaining pressure at all times. He had no other choice, because he only had one flying sword. If he used a normal flying sword attack, what would he do when 4 Seasons jumped out of the circle? Red Elephant's water element magic did not need to be charged, because it covered the entire area. More importantly, the battle characteristics of the chess game prevented him from jumping out of the circle while the flying sword was charging. When he had no choice but to stay in the circle, one flying sword was obviously not enough to maintain the pressure. Therefore, he could only choose not to retreat, not to charge, and fight with his 5 elements Dao realm. His advantage was that he had a more comprehensive understanding of the 5 elements. His weakness was that 4 Seasons was an earth sword and needed to take a few turns in the 5 elements conversion. Red Elephant's advantage was simple, and it was clear that he was extremely focused on the water element, which allowed him to perfectly display his strength. Overall control and mastery of a single element was the focus of the competition between the two. The scene looked very ordinary, without the flashes of swords, the splendor of forbidden spells, and the whistling of flying swords. However, this kind of internal life and death battle was no less intense than the outside. In the eyes of the other Jean Dan, this kind of battle was slightly boring, but the two Supremes watched with great interest. Although it was still a little immature, it was already interesting. White Brows smiled faintly. He was already considering how to give this black pawn a reward worthy of his efforts. The 5 elements were ultimately a whole. There was no such thing as reaching the peak of a single element, and there were no inherent flaws in the other 4 elements. The strength of the 5 elements was built on the operation of the whole, conversion, derivation, transformation, just as he expected. After a moment, the flying sword's speed became faster and faster, and it kept circling around Red Elephant. The power of the 5 elements on the sword also became stronger and stronger. It was still accumulating power, gaining power through the conversion of the 5 elements in the water element environment. When it reached the point where it could break through the opponent's defense, the flying sword would strike down and end the battle. Red Elephant's face was filled with sorrow. He knew that his time was coming. This was the end of a cultivator, and he couldn't blame anyone. Everyone's cultivation direction and battle direction had their own characteristics. His characteristic was that he was completely focused on the Tao of water, using a certain sense of ordinariness to achieve a different kind of excellence. For this, he gave up a lot, such as powerful spiritual weapons, countless talismans, and profound forbidden spells. It was also because of these that he could reach such heights in the water element. However, everything had its pros and cons. It was also because of his tenacity and focus in the ordinariness that he was able to kill the two black pawns, but fell into a desperate situation in front of an opponent with the 5 elements power. He couldn't even find a trump card to turn the situation around. It was also at this moment that he finally understood what it meant to be truly ordinary. There was a process of being truly ordinary. One had to experience being outstanding and stand out from the masses. The ordinary after greatness was the ordinary that saw through everything, the ordinary that had unlimited possibilities. If one was ordinary from the beginning and remained ordinary, then it would only be ordinary. Chapter 710. Until now, Lu Xiaoyi had already absorbed 3 balls of fate energy. He could basically confirm that almost every Jindan cultivator in the Zhou Upper Realm had fate energy. As for the higher realms, he was not sure yet. However, after removing the red image, the biggest change he felt was not the absorption of fate energy, but the black pawn flag. Before the arching image, his black pawn flag had reached a height of 3,000 feet because it had eaten 2 pieces. Now that the arching image was successful, the black pawn flag had grown to a height of 7,000 feet. It was the second tallest flag in the entire camp after the commander's flag, which was 10,000 feet tall. It was even 100 feet taller than the black pawn flag, which was 6,000 feet tall. This was not just symbolic. Amidst such changes, Lu Xiaoyi suddenly realized that his vision had changed. Through the settling of the black pawn flag, his spirit seemed to have merged with the black pawn flag, experiencing the ups and downs of the chessboard, as well as the bloody massacres. This heaven and earth chessboard was originally an extraordinary Dao item. It was the witness of every chessboard competition in the Zhou Upper Realm for hundreds of thousands of years. There were countless confrontations, countless battles, endless massacres, and merciless bloodshed. When all these gathered together, it formed a torrential, ferocious aura. When 2 armies faced each other, countless resentful spirits wailed in anguish, expressing their unwillingness. Spells wreaked havoc, sword auras crisscrossed Dharma world. There were no injuries. In this heaven and earth chessboard, there was only life and death. There was no victory or defeat. Lu Xiaoyi's spirit seemed to have experienced the changes of this chessboard for hundreds of thousands of years in a short period of time. From this, he suddenly understood something. Bai Mei's voice rang in his mind. In cultivation, there is nothing to fear. Although I, Bai Mei, am heartless in my actions, but if you manage to break through, I will not be stingy with my rewards. Swordsman's orthodoxy is all about battle. How can there be a swordsman who does not comprehend the killing intent? The sinking of the sword pawn flag is the reward. The killing intent of the sword. It was also a type of great Tao concept. Its essence was above the force. The force could only be borrowed, but the Tao state was one's own. It did not change according to the environment. To swordsmen, if they had to choose a Tao state, then even the 5 elements and yin and yang would have to stand aside. The most suitable for them would definitely be the killing intent. Therefore, this gift was very valuable. If Bai Mei hadn't raised the flag to 7,000 feet for him, and if he hadn't released the control of the chessboard of heaven and earth, he wouldn't have been able to understand the true essence of killing. This was also the result of the situation. He was in the middle of the game, and he was able to cross the river and sink to the bottom. But Lu Xiaoyi knew that after eating the sweet jujube, it meant that he would have to invest more in the future. White-browed White Brow had given him a chance to comprehend the Tao of slaughter, but he didn't say that this game would guarantee his safety. In front of him, it was still a stretch of blood red. The red side still had the 2 warriors, as well as the carriages, horses, and cannons. These were all obstacles that he had to overcome one by one. How should he go about it? Should he still die? Or in a different way? He didn't know either. The only thing Lu Xiaoyi was worried about now was that he would not be F*** placed in the general's tiger's mouth. That would truly be beyond his ability to call for help. The situation between the red side and the black side had changed again. The red side originally had a slight advantage, but now the black side had the upper hand. Especially now that the black side had a sunken chariot. It was a huge threat to the red side. Old Monster Gene was very experienced. He knew that he had fallen into a difficult situation with the arrangement of the chess pieces, so he simply abandoned the pieces and entered the game. At this time, there were less than 10 pieces left on the chessboard. This was the final rule of the chessboard of heaven and earth. One side's general must not be seen by the opponent's chess pieces. If they saw it, they would lose. It would never be the turn of small fries like them to decide the outcome. The confrontation between supremes, especially the confrontation between the Sun God Supremes, was not something they could understand. It was not even something they could watch. That was a confrontation between cultivators of the highest realm. Although they were in the Zhou Xian upper realm, the battle could have already taken place in the void of the universe. Time was very short, and the final outcome was unknown. All they knew was that once the huge chessboard of heaven and earth was put away, the red and black sides ceased their activities. Old Monster Gene wrapped up his chess pieces and floated away. There were still 5 players left on the black side, 1 pawn, 1 horse, 1 cannon, 1 soldier, and 1 elephant. Fortunately, the 2 spies from Qing Kong were still alive. Lu Xiaoyi counted that they had only participated in 3 battles. That didn't seem to be a lot. Looking at Qing Xian's sorry state, he wondered how many fierce battles the red side had fought in the last counterattack. Every one of you is a warrior, at least when it comes to fighting for your life in the chessboard. I hope that you can maintain this style in other situations, and not be as brave as a tiger when it comes to fighting for yourself, but in other aspects, you can't. These 5 cultivators had all violated the commandments of the Zhou Xian upper realm. Of course, 2 of them were different, but it didn't matter. It was just a small Jin Dan, it was nothing. There were 3,000 unorthodox schools in the Zhou Xian upper realm. Their orthodoxy was complicated and strange, and no one would bother to get to the bottom of it. Among them, there were always some special ones. For the 9 upper sects, they could just keep them in their pockets. This was also a way for the 9 upper sects to maintain the vitality of their sections. Why were the 2 of you cowering at the other side of the crack? Why were you so hesitant and overcautious? Why don't you tell me the truth? Qing Xian reported, "Don't be angry, perfected lord. We had no choice. Because the exit on the other side was heavily guarded, we pulled together a group of refugees that we met by chance to break through the barrier. Under our guidance, everyone rushed out together. However, what we didn't expect was that this group of people had some strange abilities. They could extend the space of the crack and then pull the defenders into the crack as well, thus gaining the initiative to enter the other world. The 3 of us were caught off guard and fell into their trap. As a result, we rushed out of the crack and were pulled back. The crack's exit was lost, so we could only return the way we came." Bai Mei was disdainful. "Are you done? I know you're telling the truth, but I also know that even if you're telling the truth, as long as you pick and choose, you'll definitely be able to cover up the truth." He pointed at them. "Since you've already rushed out, why didn't you leave as soon as possible? What were you waiting for? It's not unusual for a crack in space to extend. However, I've never heard of a crack that didn't retract after it extended. The power of nature is not something that can be affected by human factors. Do you dare to say that the cultivators who were pulled in by the crack are like you, staying in the crack forever? If others can go out, why can't you? Is it because you can't? Or because you don't want to?" Sun God's judgment hit the nail on the head. "Wasn't that the truth of the 3 of them at that time?" Bai Mei snorted. "I know that you're not willing to carry out such a mission. You'll be trapped in a foreign land for the rest of your lives and lose the space of the upper realm. Therefore, you're very reluctant in your hearts. Therefore, you deliberately stayed in the crack because you were betting that Zhou Xian would pull you back. That's why I sentenced you to death and threw you into the chessboard of heaven and earth to decide your own life and death. Do you dare to say that I've wronged you?" Qing Xian and Lu Xiaoyi bowed. "Perfected Lord has discerning eyes. It's the truth. We had selfish intentions. We're guilty of death." Chapter 711. Bai Mei snorted. "I'm a man of my word. Since I participated in this game of chess, I'll let bygones be bygones. But I want to remind you that if there's a next time when you're too timid to advance, you won't even have the chance to play a game of life and death. Qing Xian Lu Xiaoyi was embarrassed. He lowered his head and agreed. The three of them behaved just as Bai Mei said at the exit of the crack in the land of exile. They were not wronged. Putting aside the fact that it was the first time they came out of the crack and had the possibility of breaking out, the three of them went deeper into the crack when everyone else was squeezing towards the shrinking crack. It was obvious that they wanted to use this as an excuse to announce that they had failed the mission and wanted to return to the upper realm of Zhou Xian. Elder Xian means that you won't be punished, just to redeem yourself the next time. So, do you think it's better to punish you this way, or to redeem yourself by doing good deeds? Elder Xian was the person in charge of this trip to the crack of fate. The so-called redeeming themselves by doing good deeds meant that they would be sent back to do good deeds the next time. Bai Mei's words were to let the two of them know how to be grateful. It was Bai Mei who had pulled the two of them out of exile. Although the chess game was a little thrilling, at least they survived. They didn't have to worry about the next long journey and were completely free from this mission. But in Qing Xian Lu Xiaoyi's ears, they complained incessantly. If what Elder Xian said was true, they would have been sent back to the land of exile by Zhou Xian after investigating here for decades. How perfect would that be? It was the highest realm of being a spy, letting the other party be in charge of their transportation. Unfortunately, Bai Mei had messed it up, but on the surface, they had to pretend to be grateful. Thank you for your punishment, perfected Lord. We will not let you down. Bai Mei glanced at the five of them. The five of you have committed a grave mistake. All of you deserve the death penalty. But since you've died once in the game of chess, you've avoided the disaster. But if you take the blame like this, it'll be like child's play. When the news gets back, there won't be any warning. Therefore, you can't return to your original sect. Stay in the 9 great divine mountains as outer disciples. After a few hundred years, when no one remembers you, you can return. This was a blatant recruitment of talents. After all, those who were able to stay alive on the chessboard of life and death were relatively redeemable. The luckiest of the 5 had also experienced a battle and could be considered as one of the best in Jindan. The major powers would never let go of these people. What was there to talk about returning after a few hundred years? He had been a disciple of free and unfettered God Mountain for several hundred years. Could he still go back? It was just a reminder to them not to contact their original sect. Qing Xian and Lu Xiaoyi were left with no choice but to grit their teeth and express their gratitude to them. Carefree travel was one of the 9 great mountain sects. There was no need to talk about their skills, resources, connections, and teachers. It was definitely 100 times better than their original sect. But for the 2 spies, it was a mixed blessing. Putting aside cultivation and focusing solely on the objective of the mission, there were benefits to being in a major sect. They were well informed, and they would be able to gather more information. However, it was also more dangerous. There were many major cultivators there, and the slightest bit of carelessness could give them away. If they were free, they would not need to be on tenterhooks all the time. They would be able to move around freely. As for information, they would be able to gather information slowly. Bai Mei thought for a while. It was not good for the free and unfettered travel to swallow these 5 people. These people came from the 3,000 unorthodox sections. Some are found by him. Some are found by his friends. After all, they were all Jindan, and there were also very promising seeds in the world of cultivation. If he swallowed them all, it would be very unsightly. It would also be easy for others to talk about it. How would he tell his friends the next time something like this happened? One must know how to share profits. Even if the 9 great sects did not have enough, it would not be easy to divide. However, it was not good to ignore friends who came to him. After some consideration, he already had a plan. Huai Ming, you're from Xilangdi. Go to Wanyan, and you will have a lot of benefits. Quan Su, your foundation is profound. Go to Taixian and Zhonghuang, and you will have a different world. Qing Tong, Jiushan, Shan Air, what you have learned is not orthodox. It is the unorthodox soul art, body art, and sword vein art. It is difficult to find a route in the 9 great holy mountains. Only I, the free and unfettered travel, have dabbled in all aspects. Is the proper place to go? Do you have any opinions? Who would dare to have any opinions? Of course, the one with the highest fist realm would have the right to speak. Among the 5 people, Bai Mei thought highly of only 2. One was Quan Su, the black soldier. Although she was not conspicuous in the early stages of the game, she played a big role in the later stages of the game when Old Monster Gene put all his eggs in one basket. Her foundation was quite solid. But this time, the people in the game relied on Elder Shin support. He gave the right to use the 3 people in the crack to him. They had known each other for thousands of years. Of course, he had to return the favor. Quan Su was such a beauty, and she came from the crack. It was not good to enjoy her alone. Of course, he had to give her to his friend's sections. The other person he thought highly of was Sean Air, the black soldier. He was also a Ritter Knee from the crack. He was on the opposite end of the spectrum from Quan Su. His cultivation in Taoism was limited, but he was gifted in combat. He had a lot of potential. Since Quan Su gave Huang Zhong Huang from Taixien, Sean Air had to be kept. The heritage of the free and unfettered travel was the most diverse among the 9 great sects. They could teach anything. Where was the free and unfettered travel? Where was the Taixien middle sect? Was Yugu dead or alive? The 2 of them were not sure, but they did not know how to communicate. They did not even look at each other. From the moment they entered the immortal of Zhou upper realm, they were no longer friends. They were just traveling companions who had traveled through the spatial cracks for decades. They could only face the future alone. They could not count on others to help them. This was the prerequisite for safe hiding. They were very glad that they belonged to the same side in the chessboard of heaven and earth. Otherwise, if they were red and black, with their personalities, they could only use a sword to fight basic spells. They would use the most aggrieved way to decide life and death. They could not say anything until they died. The 2 of them would go to Huang Zhong Huang from Taixien and Xiao Yao from free and unfettered travel in the future. They were the instigators and executors of the fate of the land of exile. In this sense, they were very close to the truth. However, the distance between 2 supreme Yang spirit lords and 2 Jin Dance stage cultivators was so far apart that they might never meet in this lifetime. When they arrived, they were full of lofty aspirations. However, when they arrived, they were hit by reality. Lu Xiaoyi wanted to seek the truth, but he found that he was wrong. In the cultivation world, the truth was not found, but waited. If you should know, you would know when the time was right. If you did not know, you could only bury the secret in your heart. You would not even have the chance to pass it home. Chapter 712. Bai Mei rolled up the 5 of them with his sleeves. Of course, he didn't need to go through the crack. The crack couldn't hold a great cultivator like him. In just a moment, he went around the several sacred mountains in Zhouxian, leaving Huai Ming and Quan Su behind. Finally, he brought the 3 chosen juniors back to the carefree continent, a huge continent with a radius of more than 100,000 miles. In the center of the continent, there was a sacred mountain that stood alone. The mountains and rivers were beautiful, and the Tao was picturesque. There were poems as proof. Carefree mountain in the carefree heaven, carefree fate in the carefree heaven, carefree fate and other carefree people lived in the carefree mountain. With Lu Xiaoyi's shallow understanding, what was carefree? It was to be free to do whatever you wanted. To do whatever you wanted, to practice whatever you wanted. Bai Mei threw the 3 of them in front of the carefree mountain. Although I brought you into the carefree travel, there is no relationship between us. I'm neither your backer nor your thigh. Don't talk nonsense in front of others, and don't think nonsense behind others. You 3 admire my carefree travel and would rather give up your original orthodoxy to become my disciple. No one knows what happened on the chessboard. In fact, many people in the carefree travel don't even know of my existence. So, in the future, you have to fight for it yourselves. Bai Mei disappeared in a flash, leaving the 3 of them looking at each other. They thought they were hugging onto a thick thigh, but it turned out that the thigh was too thick. They couldn't hug at all. It was more like hugging a leg hair. This was a big family. Listen to what he said. This was your voluntary action. You admired the carefree travel and came to join. No one forced you to come. Did you dare not to come? Did you dare to leave? Among the three of them, Ching Tong sighed and smiled bitterly. Let's climb the mountain. Who asked us to admire him? The three of them began to climb the mountain. In fact, they were walking close to the ground. If they weren't from the carefree travel sect, they wouldn't dare to fly in the mountains. Jioshan was a little wishful thinking. If he really doesn't care about us, will he look down on our potential and not accept us? Ching Tong laughed. Brother Jioshan, you're thinking too much. Since it's the Yang spirit ancestor's idea, he'll definitely send a message that we're coming to join the mountain. It's just that there are 8 turns and 7 hurdles. When we really get to the cultivator in charge, no one will know who asked for it. Don't worry. No matter how bad your performance is, he'll definitely accept you. Now you want to go home? What are you thinking? The two of them looked at Lu Xiaoyi. In the chessboard of heaven and earth, this swordsman's strength was really impressive. This was what the world of cultivation looked at. Therefore, although he did not speak, no one dared to take him lightly. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. My 2 brothers were already at this stage. The arm can't win against the thigh. Why don't you give up on your other thoughts? Haven't you heard? Hundreds of years later, if we can live until then, we can think about other problems. Right now, we're 3 pilgrims who admire the inheritance of the divine mountain. The 3 of them were not easy to deal with. Each of them had their own secrets. Just from the fact that each of them had committed the capital crime of Zhou Xian, it was clear what kind of people they were. However, even if they were extremely daring, coming to the carefree travel sect, one of the 9 great sects, they still didn't dare to offend them in the slightest. They were like fierce bandits from the countryside who were brought to the imperial court. That immortal aura was irresistible. Coming to the mountain wasn't as troublesome as they thought. They couldn't enter the sect, so there were all kinds of tedious procedures and tests. The result was already predetermined, so there was no need for that. They had only climbed a few steps when a Taoist guide came over. His attitude was quite good as he led the 3 of them forward. With the carefree travel sect guidance, the journey was very smooth. They passed through pavilions, halls, and corridors. It was much faster than them blindly searching. Along the way, Lu Xiaoyi basically didn't see any foundation establishment cultivators. Even if there were, they were basically doing shady business of serving people. This also proved that Yuhu's words were not false. In the 9 great sects of the Zhou Xian upper realm, the basic requirement to enter was Jin Dan, not foundation establishment. This also indirectly reflected the overall cultivation level of the Zhou Xian upper realm. It was indeed very high. It was so high that they didn't even take foundation establishment seriously. The adjacent hall was the place where the 3 of them were received. The initiation ceremony was very simple. It was obvious that the carefree travel sect's reception Taoist was very clear about their origins. The world is like a neighbor. We come from all over the world. We all have one goal, and that is cultivation. I am Gao Tang, in charge of the allocation and guidance of the new disciples. Since the 3 of you admire my carefree travel sect's orthodoxy and have superior cultivators as your guarantee, then there is no need for some complicated rules. I only have one question here. Did the 3 of you join voluntarily? Were you forced? Are there any hidden circumstances? Ching Tong, as my heart desires. Jioshan, I've been waiting for a long time. Lu Xiaoyi, from the bottom of my heart. Gao Tang laughed and gestured with his hand. He wrote their names on the clear book and tossed it up. It turned into a clear light and scattered to all parts of the carefree God Mountain. From now on, they were no longer outsiders here, but their own people. Every place that Jin Dan was allowed to enter would leave their information. It was very simple, and there was no need to make it so complicated. To the powerful upper sects of the Divine Mountain, Jin Dan was just the beginning of the path of cultivation. He threw 3 jade scrolls over. Everything is in these scrolls. Cultivation, life, rules, cave abode, rights, obligations. You're all Jin Dan now. There are many things that you don't need to be taught personally. Read it once, and you will naturally understand. When the three of them walked out of the adjacent hall, they looked at the beautiful mountains that stretched endlessly. They could not believe that they had joined the top 9 upper sects of the Zhou upper realm so easily. The simpler it was, the more unusual it was. The three of them were thoughtful people and understood this principle. The first thing they had to do was to browse through the Jade Scrolls. The information of hundreds of thousands of words was memorized by them in no time. The brain of a Jindan cultivator could already be used as a small scanner. To a cultivator, learning was the most basic skill. Qing Tong nodded at the two of them. The chessboard of heaven and earth is a battle of life and death. Those who survive are the strong ones. This is fate, and we must cherish it. Looking at the rules of the Carefree God Mountain, they may seem indifferent, but they're actually rules and regulations. It's just that they're not so obvious. The three of us are new here, and we don't know what factions, branches, or interests there are here. We can only watch and see. However, there is one thing. In name, the three of us are people who have abandoned our original orthodoxy. We like the new and hate the old, and we are suspected of being fickle. The righteous and noble people of the orthodoxy look down on people like us the most. However, who knows that we are also forced and helpless? If there is such trouble, we don't need to help. We just need to exchange information so that others can be prepared. Chapter 7:13. It's only right. Lu Xiaoyi and Jioshan nodded in agreement. They were both old foxes who had been cultivating for hundreds of years. How could anyone who committed a capital crime be free of charge? Groups and factions existed everywhere. This had nothing to do with whether one was from the Divine Mountain or the Mortal Mountain, the Upper Sect or the Unorthodox Sect. As long as it was a human cultivation sect, it was impossible to eliminate these things. This was the nature of humans and the distribution of benefits. They still did not know the specific differences between the factions, but there were definitely two directions. One was the orthodoxy. Since the Xiao Yao sect was a hodgepodge, there would definitely be differences between the various factions. This was the official issue. The other was just as Qing Tong said, their origins. In a place like the cultivation world, where people respected their teachers, if you betrayed your own orthodoxy and joined the upper sect of the Divine Mountain, you would not be able to avoid a series of disdain. It was almost inevitable that you would be ostracized. Hence, what Qing Tong said was actually the condensation of rich life experience. The three of them understood this point. They raised their hands and said goodbye. The three of them went their separate ways. Although they understood, it was impossible for the three of them to gather together for warmth. They were used to being wild and hid their pride in their hearts. They really did not have much respect for the upper sect of the Divine Mountain. Only in the process of cultivation in the future, when they encountered the gap between them and the real disciples of the Divine Mountain, would they slowly change or remain proud. Lu Xiaoyi flew leisurely in the Xiao Yao Mountain. He needed to go through everything that happened today. There was too much information, and he was also a Li Gui. He had a guilty conscience. This time, entering the Zhou upper realm was very smooth. It could even be said that it was smooth beyond imagination. Humans were like this. When you were nervous, you would hope that everything would go smoothly and that there would be less heresy. That was because the two of them could not be investigated. But when everything went smoothly, you would start to wonder if it was a trap. Was it a group of high-level cultivators watching the two monkeys playing tricks? There were countless reasons, but they all pointed to the opposite. He was also someone who had seen the world. When he was at the fifth ring, he had already seen the immortal cultivators when he entered the Foundation establishment realm. At that time, he was also full of secrets. In the end, the immortal cultivators did not take him seriously. There was a very important concept. You, a Foundation establishment Jindan, may think you're more important than the heavens, but in the eyes of a true monarch, you're not even worth a fart. Great cultivators were actually very impatient to meddle in the affairs of small cultivators. In the cultivation world, it had always been popular to meddle in the affairs of small cultivators. Jindan was in charge of Foundation establishment. Yuan Ying was in charge of Jindan, and true monarchs were in charge of yuanying. This was the right way. Therefore, the major cultivators would rather believe that some of the minor details were an accidental opportunity that was not rare in the cultivation world, and would not delve into the real source. If they were too serious, every cultivator had their own secrets. If a senior cultivator were to investigate every suspicious person, he would not be able to cultivate for the rest of his life. When a tiger looked at an ant, would it think that it was a worker ant? Was he still a combat ant? Who would pay attention to the fact that it had grown an extra leg? Why is half of her but red? This was a reason to comfort himself, and also a reason to scare himself. You who came out of the crack. How could a person possessed by a demonic spirit escape from the true monarch's senses? He was even a sun god, true monarch. Although you who said that he was fine, the master who saved him said that he was originally a soul with human thoughts, and was different from the soul bodies naturally formed in the universe. He would not be discovered if he possessed a human body, and people would only think that he was a cultivator who practiced soul techniques. But in the end, he still had doubts in his heart. There was also the matter of fate. Lu Xiaoyi knew that his fate was definitely different from the fate of the cultivators in the upper world of Zhou Xian. He and Qing Xian had directly obtained the fragments of fate that had collapsed, and they were truly possessed by fate. On the other hand, the fate in the upper world of Zhou Xian was so widespread that it could only be man-made wholesale, and it was divided into two types, active and dormant. How could a sun god, true monarch, not see such a difference? Or perhaps he did not see it at all? As for the other small problems, there were countless, such as the flying sword coming out of his head, and not from his dantian, his extraordinary understanding of the 5 elements, his powerful combat ability, and his timidity when carrying out tasks, and so on. In his own opinion, his tail was already out of his pants. He hoped that he was just scaring himself. In front of the sun god, any caution was necessary. But now, he could only pretend that no one had discovered his secret. Otherwise, he would not be able to live his life. He forced himself to pull his mind out of speculations and pay more attention to the current situation. Even if he might be played like a monkey, he still had a chance to play, right? The number of Xiaoyao wandering and yuanying was unknown, but there were more than 5,000 Jin Dan, which was nearly half more than the 5th ring Xianyuan sword sect, and even more than the supreme and 3 pure ones. With such a huge base of Jin Dan, it was possible to roughly estimate the number of Zhenren and true monarchs. The quality was hard to say, as it had not been measured. However, the core of the cultivation world's stable inheritance was the explosive number of soldiers, not the elite strategy. This was the deep-seated reason why the Xianyuan sword sect could not dominate. There were 9 such upper sects in the upper world of Zhou Xian. There were also 3,000 unorthodox sections. If they were united, their strength would definitely exceed the 5th ring. Of course, there were also variables. Could these 9 upper sects be united against external forces? Could their cultivation be like the 5th ring, where they could unite in the face of external aggression? The 3,000 unorthodox sects were all small sections. He was afraid that they were far from the fighting strength of the 5th ring's many medium-sized forces. This was a general judgment. Specifically, in his current situation, finding an immortal's cave was the first thing he needed to do. Cultivators regarded the world as their home and could settle down anywhere. Even with an immortal's cave, the time he could cultivate in it was limited. However, humans were like this. Even if he only lived here for a few days a year, he had to have his own nest. Not physically, but psychologically. The gold core experts of the free and unfettered travel rarely set up residence on the carefree mountain. In fact, they were simply scattered across the vast land of the free and unfettered continent. They did not live in groups and lived a free and unfettered life. This was due to the unique cultivation environment of the Xiaoyao continent. In such a large piece of land, there was no other orthodoxy. Therefore, Xiaoyao Mountain was the Xiaoyao continent, and the Xiaoyao continent was Xiaoyao Mountain. These Jin Dan of Xiaoyao wandering lived scattered across the Xiaoyao continent. Thousands of people were scattered across the land of about 100,000 miles. In fact, they were also scattered. They planted leaves and flowers around their immortal's cave to cultivate the next generation of disciples for Xiaoyao wandering. They did not care about the formalities. The principle was that there could only be one Jin Dan in a cave. They could not gather together to prevent the emergence of sections. Of course, there were also many who did not set up their immortal's cave and did not stay in one place. They wandered everywhere. There were even Xiaoyao cultivators who wandered the entire upper world of Zhouxian. There were also those who settled down in other continents. Because they were Xiaoyao, they were loose. This was indeed the way of immortals, but it was not necessarily the way of battle. For hundreds of thousands of years, the upper world of Zhouxian had not experienced any wars. Chapter 714. Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to set up his abode of immortals in Xiaoyao Mountain, at least for a short period of time. He was a newcomer and had too many things to explore. Since he had already entered the sect, it would be a waste of this trip to the crack if he did not experience the secret techniques of Xiaoyao travel. In the world of cultivation, teachers and teachings were respected, but they were not inflexible. Sects did not stop their disciples from entering other orthodoxies when they went out of the boundary into the universe. Most of the time, this was a last resort. A one-track mind would not last long, especially for a small Jin Dan like Lu Xiaoyi and Qing Xian. It would be meaningless if one insisted on not joining a sect when he accidentally went to a new world. He needed to understand the so-called 9 upper sects on Xiaoyao Mountain. This place was also the closest to the source of information he wanted, so he needed to open up. The place was too big, and there were too many beautiful sceneries. He did not care about the choice and hurriedly settled down. The Carefree Travel sect was a hodgepodge of Taoist doctrines, but it wasn't accurate to say that. In fact, the main cultivation method of the Carefree Travel sect was very compatible and was suitable for all kinds of unorthodox Taoist doctrines. In addition, the ideology of the sect encouraged all kinds of birds to sing and all kinds of flowers to bloom. Therefore, although there were many kinds of strange cultivation methods, they all stayed the same. All of these came from the 3 supreme fundamental techniques of the Carefree Travel sect: Xiaoyao Travel, North Travel Knowing, and Carefree Heart Sutra. All the cultivators of Xiaoyao Travel had to choose one of these fundamental techniques. It could lead them to the upper realm and enter the Qingming. Even if they were half immortals, they would still not fall into the mortal world. On this basis, the cultivators would choose their own direction of techniques. It was all-encompassing and could be used as they pleased. The mainstream was still the martial arts of the Xiaoyao sect, but everyone's pursuit was always different. Cultivators were a kind of unconventional race. In addition, Xiaoyao Travel liked to be inclusive and did not force the cultivators to go in a fixed direction. Therefore, slowly, the cultivators of Xiaoyao Travel became more and more diverse when they fought with others. They gave people the feeling that they were a hodgepodge. This was very close to a choice of Tao. Cultivation should be like this. According to one's own interests, they would explore a wide range of different aspects. But this way of sects seemed to lack cohesion, lack of a sense of identity with the orthodoxies. If he were to cultivate in a flourishing age, there would be no problem, as it would be in line with the true meaning of Taoism. But if he were to be in a chaotic age, if you wanted to learn the way of the sword, you could do so by yourself. However, there wasn't a special place for you to gather together to learn the way of the sword. Instead, it was defined as a personal hobby and personal behavior. Similarly, for those who practiced body cultivation, those who practiced soul cultivation, those who practiced beast taming, those who played with puppets, those who practiced alchemy, those who practiced weapon crafting, and so on, the true meaning of Xiaoyao was to not gather together or form a group. Lu Xiaoyi's initial judgment was that this was a model for the development of the cultivation system, but it was not a model for combat. However, he still needed to delve deeper into this. This was because the situation of Jin Dan cultivators was different from that of the Yuanian cultivators. The main force of StarCraft belonged to the Yuanian cultivators and above. It had nothing to do with small Jin Dan cultivators. I'm a Moair, a new Jin Dan. I'll have to trouble Marshall Uncle if I want to find a suitable cultivation method in the Lost Pearl Hall. What are the rules and restrictions? The Lost Pearl Hall was named after the lost pearl of the vast sea. It meant that there would always be something you needed here. There would always be surprises, and there would always be dusty cultivation methods waiting for you to discover. The Yuanying in charge of the hall glanced at him. After examining the Xiao Yao knot, he found his name in a sect jade booklet. A trace of disgust rose in his heart. The Xiao Yao cultivators came from several sources. The most mainstream and orthodox were the disciples of the Xiao Yao cultivators scattered across the continent. Their relatives had received the teachings of the Xiao Yao orthodoxy from a young age. Their cultivation methods were orthodox, and they had a sense of belonging to the sect. After they formed their core, they would not have to take many detours. Next were the loose cultivators of the Xiao Yao continent. In fact, the orthodoxy of loose cultivators basically came from the Xiao Yao sect. It was very difficult to find other basic cultivation methods on this continent. The reason they were loose cultivators was because they could not find a master and could not ask for the abode of a Xiao Yao cultivator. Then there were the visitors from other continents. Their composition was complex, their attitudes were different, and their situations were different. Some of the Xiao Yao cultivators wanted to rob others. Some took the initiative to seek refuge. Some came to avoid danger, some came with different intentions, and some came through the back door. The Xiao Yao sect accepted all rivers into the sea. It was not a garbage collector. Since it was impossible to distinguish them one by one, the cultivators who came from other continents were generally divided into two categories. One was those who formed their core within 100 years, and the other was those who formed their core more than 100 years ago. The former had formed their core not long ago, so everything could be restarted. The latter was a habit that was hard to change, and old illnesses were hard to treat. Moreover, they especially liked to stir up trouble. They were full of Jianghu aura and were easily at risk of death. When the Xiao Yao sect accepted Jindan cultivators from other continents, those who had formed their core more than 100 years ago would usually be rejected. It was very difficult to control unless their potential was really outstanding and they had made great contributions to the Xiao Yao sect. However, this time, they accepted 3 Jindan cultivators from other continents at once. Moreover, they had formed their core more than 100 years ago. This kind of situation was very rare. Considering that there had not been any major incidents recently, it could be basically confirmed that these 3 had entered through the back door. They had entered the sect through their personal relationship with a certain great cultivator of the Xiao Yao sect. Although he had already reached the Yuanying realm, there was still a long way to go before he could reach the Yang spirit realm. It was impossible for someone like Bai Mei to make his chess game public. Therefore, he knew nothing about the inside story. He only knew that the sect had already agreed to these 3 people's request to enter the sect. What was done could not be changed. Every responsible Xiao Yao cultivator hated this kind of behavior. However, under the suppression of the elders, they were powerless to resist. The only thing they could do was to set up all kinds of obstacles and speak sarcastically. They were the mainstream, so they did not have to worry about being attacked or retaliated against. Orthodox cultivators looked down on these cultivators who had abandoned their own orthodoxy from the bottom of their hearts. There were already 2 people who came before him. The one called Qingtong or Jioshan had already been sent away by him. This Amoair was the 3rd. Of course, he had the same attitude and the same strategy. The Xiao Yao 3 main techniques must be passed down after entering the sect for 100 years. After a discussion among the elders, one must have a good character and have made contributions. This is the rule and cannot be forced. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Marshall Uncle, cultivation is difficult and life is short. If we wait for another 100 years at this age, what's the point of cultivating? This disciple has looked at the sect's regulations. It seems that there are no special requirements on the path of imparting the techniques. It only says that it's a matter of discretion. Then how should this matter be handled? There must be a way. The threshold should not be set at 100 years, right? Thousands of miles away, the heart is free and unfettered. To be so cold and keep people 1,000 miles away seems to be inconsistent with the meaning of being free and unfettered. Yuaning's face turned cold. It's a matter of discretion. That's why it's 100 years. Otherwise, we can't test the temperament of a new disciple. If you have any objections, you can ask the elders for a review. If there is a hidden reason, the elders will naturally consider it. However, I can tell you that I'm afraid you won't be able to get my vote from the elders. This is not your small place where you are unruly and disrespectful to your elders. No one will tolerate your bad habit. Chapter 7:15. Lu Xiaoyi was still smiling. With his situation, it was inevitable that he would suffer some grievances in the Carefree Travel Guild. There was nothing to complain about. With a body that was sentenced to death, his temperament was hard to control. Who in the big sects would treat him as a treasure? The white-browed old man warned them not to use his name to make things easier for themselves. In fact, he was trying to temper their temperament, dampen their spirit, and get rid of their arrogance. But he didn't want to endure it. After cultivating for hundreds of years, there was no reason for him to return to the state of a rice worm. There were thousands of Jindan in the Carefree Travel Guild. If he wanted to stand out and participate in the highest level of secrets, he couldn't keep a low profile. If he let go of his temper, if this was a trap, at least he could live happily. The senior who introduced me didn't say that to me. He said that the Carefree Travel Divine technique was a secret technique and that I could choose any treasure I wanted. Now it seems that it was all fake? Yuaning suppressed his anger. Over the years, he had seen many cultivators from the outer lands. Most of them behaved with their tails between their legs. It was rare for someone to be so impudent when they first arrived. There were only two possibilities. First, it was his nature to be arrogant. Second, he really had a strong background. Such a strong background might even be at the level of a true monarch. Which one was it? The faction he belonged to in the Carefree Travel Guild could be called the Native Priority Faction. Their goal was to make the Carefree Travel Guild great again. They would suppress those with impure bloodlines, unknown origins, and those who didn't follow the rules of the Carefree Travel Guild. But the premise was that they had to figure out who the real backer of this guy was. Could it be that he was different from the previous two? Otherwise, he wouldn't be so arrogant. Who recommended you? I want to see it. If we can reach an agreement, we might give you special treatment. Lu Xiaoyi spread his hands. He didn't let me say. He pretended to be innocent. If I knew this, why would I come to the Carefree Travel Guild? I might as well go to Tai Xian, Middle Yellow, or Myriad Evolutions. I don't see the 100-year limit here. Fine, 100 years it is. Then what about the specific techniques? How many years is the limit? If you're still so harsh, you could just tell me how to quit the Carefree Travel Association. That way, everyone can stop worrying. Anyway, I didn't learn anything from the Carefree Travel Association, so I can't leak it. The sitting Taoist master suppressed his anger. After nearly 1,000 years of cultivation, he knew the true meaning of Xiaoyao. He could not lose his composure just like that. In his heart, he had a rough judgment. The person who recommended this guy must have some status in Xiaoya travel. He did not hear any rumors from the elders. This meant that this person's backer came from a higher level of monarch. He had to consider this influence. The Council of Elders played an important role in the process of accepting cultivators from the outer continent into the free and unfettered travel. They could basically decide whether a cultivator would stay or leave. The immortals rarely interfered because their attention was not on such trivial matters. However, once they opened their mouths, how could the Council of Elders not give them face? He wanted to ruthlessly suppress these Jindan newcomers from the outer lands, but the prerequisite was that he would not be embroiled in the inexplicable dissatisfaction of the upper echelons. There was no way to guard against it, and there was no way to explain it either because he could not find out which senior marshal uncle it was. It was a bit difficult to get off the tiger. He could not be sure if this guy really had something to rely on or if he was just putting on a show. He had already said that he could not go back on his words about the 100-year limit of the three main cultivation methods. He could not afford to lose face like this, but he could not make things too difficult for him in the selection of the following techniques. If this fellow were to go all out just like that, he might end up being blamed by the other teachers. Techniques were a small path that did not involve the fundamentals. So what if he loosened the restrictions? Without the support of the three main cultivation methods of xiaoyao travel, these things were like water without a source. Where could he cultivate? There are no restrictions on techniques. There are thousands of secret techniques in the Lost Pearl Palace. As long as they are on display, you can choose from them. Since he'd already opened his mouth, he might as well open it wider. These cultivators from the outer continent had probably never seen such a rich, complete, profound, and extensive sea of techniques in their entire lives. It was easy for them to be intoxicated by it. For example, this guy was only in the early stage of Jindan. If he immersed himself in the path of techniques for a few years, he would miss the path of cultivation. This was also a kind of trap. You can't say that I'm making things difficult for you, right? Lu Xiaoyi smiled. I was born in the sword vein. I love swordsmanship the most. It's the fortune of 3 lifetimes to be able to further my studies here. He was arrogant before and purposely put on a show to hide his intentions. In fact, it was because of his swordsmanship. Cultivation methods? He did not care at all. In the dozens of years on Mount Shao, he had already prepared the second main cultivation method for himself. He even prepared the third main cultivation method, the 5 elements shift and the chaotic heavenly heart strategy. His Xianling Big Dipper Sutra could not be changed. To a swordsman, the 3 main cultivation methods of the free and unfettered travel were not suitable. They were too relaxed and focused on preserving health. They were not suitable for a swordsman who paid attention to explosive power. The reason why he expressed his dissatisfaction was to confuse the Yuanying enlightened being. Since he had set up obstacles in the main cultivation methods, he could only give him a way out in terms of techniques. Zhouxian Upper Realm might have its own unique wonders in terms of cultivation methods, but might not be better than the 5 rings of the Supreme 3-Purity Temple. He did not come here to seek knowledge. He came here with other intentions. In the process, he wanted to broaden his horizons. His main purpose was to strive for perfection in the swordplay technique. The enlightened being snorted. Zhouxian Upper Realm has 9 sword vein. Including your original sect, 9 sword veins, swordsmanship might not be as good as my free and unfettered families. Whether it's a lie or not, you'll know once you see it. However, you shouldn't bite off more than you can chew. You don't need me to teach you how to grasp it, do you? The last sentence was purely perfunctory. He was very clear about the problem of these swordsmen. Once the topic of swordsmanship was brought up, they could not take their eyes off it. They wanted nothing more than to learn everything. If they were so obsessed, they would neglect their fundamental cultivation. If they did not cultivate their heart and mind, how would they have the chance to reach the upper realm when they reach the end of their lifespan? He did not mind giving this kind of help to the outerland cultivators a few more times. However, he did not expect that the single-eared swordsman in front of him came from the purest sword vein orthodoxy in the universe. Mastery of martial arts and techniques was the basic skill of every swordsman. Lu Xiaoyi did not want to learn too much swordsmanship. He only wanted to study the strengths of other sects and make the most comprehensive derivation of his swordplay technique. He must make sure that nothing goes wrong. This was because his next goal was to prepare for the swordlight division. This was a watershed to measure the level of a swordsman's skills. His swordlight division was bound to be different from others. There were 3 paths in front of him. The outer sword's traditional illusory sword form, the inner sword's rampant scraping sword pill, and the swordplay technique's swordlight division. He had studied the first 2 paths for hundreds of years. His spiritual power had long reached a certain level. If it was not for the swordplay technique, he would have started long ago. However, he now intended to gain a deeper understanding of the swordplay technique before deciding which path he should follow. Perhaps he could learn the strengths of each of the 3 paths? Learn swordsmanship? That was something he would only do 100 years ago. Chapter 716. Both of them had their own ulterior motives and were scheming against each other. Both of them thought that they had succeeded, so the originally tense atmosphere finally eased up. Maintaining their superficial respect for each other, Lu Xiaoyi bade farewell and walked towards the depths of the Lost Pearl Hall. This was basically a space-type hall of ancient records. It was a set of halls within halls, with rooms within rooms. He had the Xinyuan knot and the permission of the enlightened master, so he could enter and leave most of the halls freely. Generally speaking, the free and unfettered travel was a very open orthodoxy. Just by looking at their name and style of conduct, one would know that they would not set up unnecessary obstacles in such an ancient records place. In this aspect, they were similar to the Xinyuan sword sect. When a cultivator reached the Jindan, the sect would not interfere too much with the direction of their cultivation. They were already fully mature individuals and had the right to decide their own future. In fact, almost all the ancient sects in the universe were like this. They didn't lack cultivation techniques and could selflessly provide them. It all depended on whether the cultivator could find the most suitable cultivation technique in the sea of cultivation techniques. The sword room was his destination. When Lu Xiaoyi walked in, he was like a fish returning to the sea or a bird returning to the sky. He started from the most basic theory of the coiling sword. Compared to the incomplete coiling sword technique he obtained in the Blue Sky Thousand Isles region, the coiling sword here was the real treasure. He finally understood that the coiling sword technique could not only coil the 5 elements, but also yin and yang. Tai Chi could also be coiled. In theory, the 36 innate great Taoists could coil the sword freely. However, in the Jindan realm, cultivators could barely come into contact with the most basic of the 5 elements and yin and yang, and this was achieved through external objects just like the sword rack under the volcano on the isolated island in the Thousand Isles region. After all, in the Jindan realm, cultivators who could deeply understand the Tao realm were rare. Among the 9 orthodoxies with the sword vein in the Zhou realm, 7 coiled the sword through external objects of the 5 elements, and 2 coiled the sword through external objects of yin and yang. This depended on which external object the sect possessed. Just like the Xinyuan sword sect sword tomb, small world, and the sword box world on the way sword. It had to be said that the achievements of the sword range that had been coiled for tens of thousands of years were incomparable to Lu Xiaoyi's own research, whether in theory or experience. He relied on his innate affinity with the sword and his understanding of the 5 elements. Other than that, his experience was very limited. His gains were extremely rich. For example, the balance of the 5 elements in the sword plate. How could he increase the speed of the revolving sword? The difference between the plate and plate? How? Swords, and swords? How to use the front and back discs to control 2 flying swords at the same time? How to raise a spirit for the sword plate in the mustard seed? How sword, spirit, swords, sword, how swords, and how swords, swords. This was a door. It opened a new world, heaven and earth for Lu Dao. Let him know that the swordsmanship system of this cultivation world was not as simple as he thought. A person's wisdom was insignificant compared to the wisdom of a group over a long period of time. Even if he wanted to create his own external swordsmanship, the process was extremely difficult and complicated. It could not be completed at a certain stage, but it would definitely run through his entire life of cultivation and would never stop. Not to mention that there were many kinds of sword attack techniques based on this. However, in terms of sword attack techniques, after the sword plate ejected the shape of a flying sword, it was very similar to Xuanyuan sword box flying sword technique. They both focused on the engraving of sword formations, but they were different ways to achieve the same goal. However, the influence of the sword releasing method was far-reaching because it was related to 2 very important aspects. One was whether one could release the sword against the opponent under any circumstances without worrying about the opponent's realm suppression. The other was the sword light division. The influence of the sword releasing method on the sword light division was almost fundamental. It was worth it. Originally, he came to the upper world of Zhou with the intention of finding out the truth, but he did not expect to solve a shortcoming of his swordsmanship here. When he made a careful comparison of the three methods, he had countless ideas in his mind. He still needed to verify them one by one. He could not rush. Searching and reaping, giving and receiving, he cultivated and moved forward in this entanglement. If he did not have a strong sense of belonging to the five rings, to Qing Kong, and to Xian Yuan, he would not have taken the risk to come here. He would also not have a more comprehensive understanding of the swordsmanship system. In the end, he would still very likely choose Xuanyuan's traditional sword releasing method, and there would be no new world of swordsmanship. Swordsmanship was a system, and it was the same as all other systems. If a beginner was faced with such a vast sea of swordsmanship, he would definitely lose his way. He would not even be able to accurately determine where to start. However, Lu Xiaoyi was different. He had been immersed in the world of swordsmanship for more than 300 years. To a certain extent, he already had the potential of a master. He could see through the essence of most of the sword manuals with just a glance. With the support of the purist Xuanyuan's swordsmanship philosophy, it was difficult for him to take a wrong turn. This also allowed him to quickly clarify the essence of the sword disc. He abandoned the superficial impermanence and magnificence and determined what was the most important thing in it. A month later, Lu Xiaoyi put down the jade slip in his hand and sighed with satisfaction. He had found a new way for himself in swordsmanship. If everything went well, his swordsmanship system could probably be finalized. He made a detailed plan for his swordsmanship cultivation, from easy to difficult, from simple to complicated. First of all, the sword could not be stopped and had to be sped up. The positive and negative discs were the best way to control two flying swords at the same time. The positive discs were to control the swords in a clockwise direction with the 5 elements. The negative discs were to control the swords in a counterclockwise direction with the 5 elements. When the two were carried out at the same time, they would complement each other and greatly reduce the power of the 5 elements. It would also increase the speed of controlling the swords and the daily time to use the power of the 5 elements. It could achieve at least twice the current speed. Secondly, it was urgent to modify the flying swords and integrate the top-grade materials of the 5 elements. He had already tasted the benefits of using external materials in the Valley of Thousands of Chances. Old Man Huang was right. The use of external materials was an important part of cultivation. There was no reason to ignore it and pretend to be noble. In the upper realm of Zhou, Lu Xiaoyi saw a lot of top-grade materials in the jade slip introduced by the sect. Since he was here, of course, he had to make the best use of everything. No matter what method he used, he had to start his journey of collecting materials. He had a sword spirit. It was much faster for him to integrate materials than an ordinary swordsman. Good materials could not only improve the quality of the flying swords, but through their power, it could also make controlling the swords easier. These two things could be done immediately. The only problem was that he did not have enough spirit stones in his pocket. He was not very clear about the currency system and trading system in the upper realm of Zhou. Even if he hated these things, he had to force himself to do it. He could not cling to the noble image of the Sima family's young master. This was one of his shortcomings. It was time to change. Chapter 717. Then, there were two plans for the future. One was to nurture the sword, and the other was to split the sword light. Regarding how to nurture the sword, it was a pleasant surprise for Lu Xiaoyi. For him, ever since he started cultivating the sword, his method of nurturing the sword had been constantly changing. The sword box, the sword mud pill, and the sword box of the Wei Sword Mountain. It seemed that he had never found a more perfect method that could be used for a long time. However, he saw hope in the free wandering sword. The orthodoxy of the free wandering sword was exceptionally proficient in the application of the spirit. This was also one of the few strengths that they relied on to run rampant in the upper realm of Zhou. This was because the three main exercises were especially focused on the cultivation of the spirit. It was also because of the strength of the spirit that they deduced many methods on how to nurture the spirit in the Mud Pill Palace. It was not only limited to flying swords, but also other things such as spiritual weapons great medicine, and so on. It didn't matter what the nest was. What was important was that the nest was constructed using one's mind. It had to be connected to the heavenly Tao and the earth spirit. It had to be integrated with the cultivator's consciousness and could automatically upgrade as the cultivator advanced. It was an evolved spirit nest. This kind of supreme application of the spirit was difficult for other orthodoxies to imitate because the spirit was insufficient. However, this was not the case for Lu Xiaoyi. His spirit had always been his strength. On the contrary, he was often troubled by how to use this kind of power to achieve the best results in his later cultivation. The Sparrow Palace was the extreme application of the spirit in the mind of the free wandering sword. It was structured like a sparrow, but it could grow with the person. It could freely form various environments in the Sparrow Palace that the cultivator wanted to nurture the spirit. At the same time, it was also a kind of protection. It protected the cultivator's sea of consciousness so that it would not be damaged by an out-of-control object. In addition, it also had the effect of accelerating the external release of objects. Even spiritual weapons and treasured weapons needed speed to be released. This kind of top-level inheritance was placed in each branch of the Tao room by the free wandering sword room. There was one in the sword room, one in the body room, and one in the soul room. It was also a kind of stimulation, because when you see this kind of application and feel an itch in your heart, you would naturally want to learn it. Thus, you would have to work hard to learn the three great cultivation methods. For orthodox, free, and unfettered wandering cultivators, they would have to constantly cultivate the three great cultivation methods to raise their spirit. For outerland cultivators like Lu Xiaoyi, they would have to work hard to prove their loyalty and strength in order to obtain the qualifications to cultivate the three great cultivation methods. This was a very brilliant method of guidance. It used extremely tempting techniques to help cultivators return to the importance of the Dharma. The inheritances of top-notch sects often inadvertently changed the direction of cultivators, and not through boring preaching. The establishment of the Sparrow Palace did not require any external objects. This was also the ingenuity of the free and unfettered wandering Taoist technique. In the sea of consciousness of the human body, the appearance of any external object was more or less a hidden danger. It had to be minimized to the extreme. However, the establishment of the Sparrow Palace required a special environment and specific conditions. He had just arrived at the carefree travel world and did not have such qualifications. This was his midterm goal. The long-term vision was the sword-light differentiation. His initial idea was to integrate the advantages of the three types of sword-light differentiation and make a preliminary demonstration for his brand-new swordsmanship. This was a big topic, and he had to be very careful. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi walk out of the Lost Pearl Hall with a tired face, the enlightened master pretended to be concerned. "What? Did you gain anything?" Lu Xiaoyi sighed. "Too much. Too complicated. Too deep. Disciple's mind is a bit messy. I need to go back and clear my head. Then, I will come back to work hard. I hope Martial Uncle will support me when the time comes." The enlightened master smiled with a face full of sincerity. "Don't worry. I will leave behind a verbal order. No matter who is on duty here, they will open the door wide for you. I, the free and unfettered wandering cultivators, will never be stingy in showing others what I have learned." Returning to his simple and crude abode, Lu Xiaoyi smiled slightly. "You want to dig a hole to bury me? What are you thinking?" Although he had spent all his time on the sword room swordsmanship in the past month, it did not mean that he did not know that his biggest shortcoming was his cultivation level. His obsession with swordsmanship would run through his life, but he had his own specific focus in his cultivation. Now, the highlight of every day was to break through to the middle stage of Aurus Core. If he didn't make use of such dense spiritual opportunity, it would be a reckless waste of God's gift. Then there was the sword room. Every day, he would take 1 to 4 hours to stroll around the carefree travel world's black market. He wanted to understand the price system of the Zhou Xian upper realm as soon as possible so that he could make the necessary preparations to upgrade his flying sword. We have our own ranking system for the top-notch 5 elements materials. This is the same in every market in the Zhou upper realm. There are no exceptions, and there is no possibility of picking up a bargain. In the largest and oldest market near Carefree Mountain, House of Treasures, the shopkeeper explained to him in detail. The merchants were also a group of people who did not discriminate against the cultivators from the outer lands. They only recognized spiritual stones and spiritual opportunity. On the contrary, because the cultivators from the outer lands were more willing to spend money, they spared no effort in recommending them. This was a consumer group with a lot of potential. Among the top-notch 5 elements materials, for example, the earth element materials that you need, living soil, nourishing soil, bow mud, mouth-holding sand, sun rock, and so on are third-grade materials. They're the lowest grade among the top-notch 5 elements materials. Our shop has them available at any time. Zhou, Xiangtao, heavenly meteorite, abyssal bamboo, and so on are second-grade earth element materials. They are very precious. Every market may not have them in stock, so you need to pre-order them in advance. Among the top-notch earth element materials known in the cultivation world, there are only 2 types, the heaven-mending stone and the empty, pure soil. This is something that can only be found by chance. It requires luck, and it is not something that can be bought or sold. Fellow Taoist, what kind of materials do you need? My humble shop is also considered an old shop at the foot of Shaoya Mountain. If we don't have them, you will most likely be disappointed if you go to other places. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat silent. Since he wanted to improve the quality of the flying sword, of course, he wanted to get it done in one go. He could not afford to waste time and effort. However, the truth was that even if the treasures of heaven and earth in the Zhou upper realm were far better than the 5 rings clear sky, the top-notch materials were still priceless. It was purely dependent on luck. The reason why he was unwilling to put effort into external materials was because of the bottomless pit nature of materials. There would always be better materials, and he would always want to exchange for them. Then, he would waste a lot of time looking for and accumulating resources, and on the contrary, he would relax his true cultivation. Everyone wanted good things, and he was not the only one who had this kind of idea of getting it done once and for all. How much are second-grade materials sold for? The shop owner laughed. This was basically the thought of every cultivator who came to buy 5 elements materials. First-grade materials were something that could only be found by chance. If one waited for this kind of thing until death, one might not even be able to wait until one died, so why bother? What's more, there were so many cultivators who needed it, so why would it be your turn? Therefore, in his shop, he sold second-grade materials the most. This was also the shop's strategy. In fact, if one really compared them, was there such a big difference between second-grade and third-grade materials? Chapter 718. Second-grade 5 elemental materials cost 100 to 220 pure jade spiritual essence. Third-grade 5 elemental materials cost 1 to 30 pure jade spiritual essence. The price fluctuates slightly and depends on the quality of the goods. I'm honest with you. The more you buy, the more you'll benefit. If you don't believe me, you can go to the surrounding shops to take a look. You'll know what you're looking for. The shopkeeper was very experienced. He knew that it was impossible for these cultivators from the outer lands to take out so much spiritual essence at once. They had to compare the goods from different shops and raise more funds. They couldn't make a deal in one go. They had to do it many times. In that case, it would be a competition of service quality. They had to give the customers a relaxed shopping environment and respect each other. They couldn't immediately fall if they didn't buy this time, because that wasn't the way of business. As expected, the cultivator hesitated for a moment and said awkwardly, "It's really not cheap. If it was a yuaning spiritual master, it wouldn't be difficult for him to go to the void to gather spiritual essence. But for Jindan cultivators like me, it's very difficult to gather this much. I may have to look around and find someone to lend some." The shopkeeper was very considerate. Of course, it's human nature. Without the help of a master, who could easily take out so much spiritual essence. Don't say, fellow Taoist, even if I'm a businessman all day long, my net worth will shrink by half if I take out this spiritual essence. Of course, I have to consider carefully and weigh the pros and cons. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi didn't believe his nonsense. If he could open a shop like this, how could he not be able to afford the cost of a five-elemental material? He was just taking the opportunity to get closer to each other and attract customers. However, such an attitude was indeed refreshing. After a few polite exchanges, he was about to turn and leave when he suddenly stopped and pointed at a sign pasted on the wall of the counter. What's this? When you do business with people, do you leave a record of your customers' transactions? This is a private matter. It seems a little inappropriate. The shopkeeper smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you may not know this, but the upper realm of Zhou Xian is a businessman. Integrity is the most important and privacy is the second most important. How can we easily reveal the information of our customers? What I have pasted on this wall are all the gains and losses of first-grade materials of the five elements in the last 100 years. Rare materials like these are basically not publicly priced. Instead, they're mainly auctioned. There are often additional conditions attached to the transaction. The people who obtain them are also the elites of the present age. Because it's a high-profile transaction, it's no secret in our business circle who got it. The reason why I posted it is to show the strength of Cornucopia House. In the past 100 years, there have been 8 such auctions hosted by Cornucopia House. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't help but laugh. Master is so strong, yet he says he can't afford a single material. He's really too modest. The shopkeeper also laughed. You may not know this, but House of Treasures is a chain business. Mine is just one of more than 3,000 House of Treasures. What kind of strength do we have? Lu Xiaoyi made a request. In that case, can I make a copy? I also want to see how big the gap is between myself and these spiritual creatures of heaven and earth. The shopkeeper laughed. Why not? My shop has already prepared it. There's no need to make a copy. I will naturally offer it to you. There's also the recent transaction prices of second-grade and third-grade materials in my shop. Fellow Taoist will naturally know which choice to make once he takes a look. He took out a jade slip and stuffed it into Lu Xiaoyi's hand. Humans had a yearning heart. Even if they couldn't afford the best, it was good to let them admire it. At least they could fantasize about it. For merchants, this was a very important part, because almost every cultivator would think that they were favored by the heavens. They would seek the best sex, the strongest cultivation methods, and the most precious materials in their lifetime. Because of this, many unrealistic ideas would arise. Generally, large shops would post such a notice. It was to let these people understand what kind of price they had to pay if they wanted to obtain top-grade, first-grade materials. They would dispel their fantasies and earnestly ponder over things that were within the scope of their own ability. Lu Xiaoyi thanked him and took his leave. He went out and continued to wander around. His targets were basically large shops and large businesses. He wandered around like this for a few days. He didn't buy anything, but he collected a lot of similar jade slips. Even second-grade materials of the five elements would consume more than half of his wealth. This kind of purchase didn't have much meaning to him. If he bought the earth element materials, what about the other 4 elements? He spent a lot of effort, but it still wasn't the best. Would he have to continue to change in the future and experience this again? His goal was to obtain the best first-grade materials. He didn't even need to think about the cost. Only the true elites of the Zhou Xian upper realm, cultivators who were supported by sects or clans, would be able to accept such a price and conditions. Even if Lu Xiaoyi's wealth increased by 10 times, he still wouldn't be able to reach the price offered by the seller. Moreover, the seller had some strange conditions, such as joining a sect, rebuilding a force, or investigating the truth of an incident. These things all required the support of a sect. Although Lu Xiaoyi was now considered an inner sect disciple, he was the most disliked among them. Xiao Yao, you didn't even want to give him his main cultivation method, let alone stand up for him. His idea was very simple, and also very similar to the 5th ring. That was to rob. Those who had obtained top-grade, first-grade materials of the 5 elements basically used the materials on their proudest and most powerful trump cards. Among these people, most of them were inner sect disciples, but there were also a few elites of Little Lu. Other than those who were already in the upper realm Yuanying, he still had many targets to target. He had the sword spirit, which could help him fuse and separate materials. As for the moral issues involved, to the people of the fifth ring, who in this world was clean? It was just that they were dirty in different places. In a list of these merchants, there was a large number of such cultivators. These were the targets he wanted to target. He placed his targets in the other upper sects because only these favored ones were more fearless. They didn't care about the treasures in their bodies, so there were more opportunities for him to take action. What he wanted to do was to spend some time to understand the relationship between the upper sects in the Zhou upper realm, as well as the general code of conduct of cultivators. After everything was ready, as a disciple of Xiao Yaoyu, of course, he would travel to the various holy mountains freely, and at the same time, complete his plan of stealing. The prerequisite was to first produce a few flying swords. Otherwise, with his current single flying sword, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to do it. In 5 years, he produced 5 flying swords one after another. In terms of swordsmanship, he still hadn't reached his strongest state, but he had reached the realm, the middle stage of Jindan. After more than 100 years after he formed his Aurous core, he finally made it to the middle stage of Jindan. The 7 stars in his dantian that were originally colorless became black. With the void as the background color, it made the 7 stars shine even brighter. Although he was only at the middle stage, because of the excellence of his celestial art and the quality of his Aurous core, he was no longer in an awkward position in terms of cultivation. Perhaps he couldn't suppress others in terms of cultivation, but in a battle, it became impossible for opponents to exhaust him through cultivation. This brought about a series of improvements, allowing him to finally stand firm in the Jindan. He was not afraid to challenge any cultivator of the same level. Chapter 719. There is no need to report to anyone. The ancient cultivation tradition of the free and unfettered travel made people feel very comfortable. They inherited the concept of governing by doing nothing, enjoying their own blessings and misfortunes, and indulging in their natural instincts. For a pure, immortal cultivator, this was a cultivation paradise. He would not choose to fly all the way down. The divine mountain continent was too big, and Jindan's speed was not enough in this space. If he flew from one continent to another, not to mention the vastness of the continent itself, the time needed to find people, and the time needed to pass through the sea of clouds, it would take him at least 10 years to find any cultivator who had the top-notch materials of the 5 elements. Not to mention that there might not be a suitable opportunity for some of them. Finding the right person, but giving away the precious materials to others? He would have to continue looking for the next one. Fortunately, for the disciples of the 9 divine mountains, the cost of teleporting was very low. This was also a way to encourage them to travel more and see more of the world. He could only look for the disciples of the other 8 divine mountains because they had the most first-grade materials of the 5 elements. If he went to the other 3,000 divine mountains, he would be exhausted to death. It was not easy to touch a tiger's, but because it was a tiger's, but it did not matter if it was exposed in front of others. Instead, it gave him more opportunities. In some aspects of the cultivation world, Zhou upper realm was actually similar to the 5-ring Qing Sky sect. Upper realm cultivators rarely meddled in the affairs of lower realm cultivators. They were more inclined to solve their own problems. When you hit the young, the old will come. In fact, this was not popular in the cultivation world. Even the relatively Buddhist-like upper realm of Zhou was very clear that cultivating disciples could not be too arrogant. They needed to be given space and an independent environment to do things. Otherwise, they would develop the bad habit of relying on their elders for everything. In the end, they would be cultivated into a pile of trash. He also had his own opinions on how to find people. Unlike 5 Rings or Qing Kong, his fellow disciples were either cultivating in the mountain gate or traveling outside on missions. Without news from the inside, it was very difficult to find people. However, the 9 great sacred mountains of the Zhou upper realm were different. Every sacred mountain had a vast territory. Apart from the orthodoxy of the sacred mountain itself, there was no other sect. It was as if the mountain gate was a continent that was close to 100,000 miles wide. The continent was the mountain gate. The Jin Dan disciples were scattered across the land, responsible for passing down the orthodoxy of the sect. On the other hand, the Jinren and perfected lords were more concentrated on the sacred mountain, just like the Xiao Yao Yu. This kind of situation was very suitable for doing some robberies. As long as it wasn't too excessive, no one would even investigate. This was also the reason why Lu Xiaoyi chose to return to his old profession here. Speaking of which, as a youth who came out from a proper bandit den, he had never done such a thing before. As for how to find people, it wasn't difficult in the Zhou Upper Realm. The developed Chamber of Commerce's system would provide information about the shops scattered across the continent, including the information of the cultivators guarding nearby. It was simply a paradise for robbers. However, for some reason, the profession of robber wasn't flourishing here. North Liangdao of the Yellow Court Continent. This was the most barren area of the Yellow Court Continent. It was sparsely populated, and the orthodoxy was not clear. Those who were sent to guard this place were either not powerful in the sect or had violated the sect's rules. Taoist Zhu Chong had violated the sect's rules. Of course, in his opinion, it wasn't a big mistake. It was nothing more than a momentary interest in the Tao of dual cultivation. He did some superficial research on it, possibly involving the karma of more than 10 mortal women. In the end, he was reported by a villain and was sent to this sparsely populated area. However, he had a foundation in the Huangting Taoism. It was only a few decades, so it wasn't a big deal. Moreover, he had compensated those women greatly, enough for them to live the rest of their lives without any worries. Wasn't it just that they couldn't have children? Without the burden of offspring, wouldn't their lives be better? The problem lay in the fact that, as a guardian cultivator, he was directly responsible for the local cultivation education. In other words, every 10 years, the number of cultivation seeds one could contribute to the sect would determine the conditions under which the cultivator would receive resources from the sect. He didn't care about resources. His family had an upper-level cultivator behind him, so he never had to worry about resources. However, his difficulty was in the evaluation. If he had a bad evaluation for 3 consecutive 10-year years, it would inevitably affect his time to return to the flourishing world. He worked very hard in his cultivation, but this didn't mean that he couldn't enjoy life. Because it was located in a remote area and had a sparse population, his quota was much lower than other densely populated areas. However, no matter how low it was necessary to have a Jin Dan every 10 years. He couldn't possibly have a score of 0, right? He had already had a score of 0 for 2 years. Jin Dan wasn't a foundation establishment cultivator, so the requirements in all aspects were very harsh. Moreover, he wasn't someone who could endure loneliness and was willing to settle down and educate others. This was the 3rd 10-year period. In his opinion, the chances of those foundation establishment cultivators in this area becoming Jin Dan cultivators within a few years weren't high. This forced him to think of some tricks. He would buy people from other areas with a strong cultivation atmosphere. To be more specific, he would make a deal with a fellow disciple who had a good education record. After the other party completed the 10-year task, he would recommend the extra upper-level cultivators to him. This would represent Liangbei Dao in completing the 10-year basic education target. Because of this, he had to pay a large amount of resources to this senior brother. After all, the Yellow Court sect gave generous rewards to cultivators that exceeded their quota, and the transaction price he gave would surely be more attractive than this reward, right? He couldn't make it too public. Although buying and selling quotas was an unwritten rule in the Jin Dan disciple circle, since it was an unspoken rule, he couldn't bring it up on the table. He had to take into account the reputation of all parties involved. The solution was very simple, through the ubiquitous Chamber of Commerce. Actually, the Chamber of Commerce was also backed by the Yellow Court sect. However, for the sake of spirit stones, it didn't matter if it was like this. He had found a quota. In a few days, this new Jin Dan cultivator would come to meet him to discuss some specific details and excuses. As for him, He would have to pay this person a large sum of hush money. He dared to deceive the sect after entering? This was a serious crime. Not every new Jindan cultivator had the guts to do so. Most of them would reject such a request for the sake of their bright future. Only a very small number of them had opened their spiritual eyes or were under special circumstances. Zhu Cheng didn't want to be such a sucker. Although he didn't lack resources, he wouldn't waste them either. He decided to persuade this Jindan cultivator after meeting him. He could first show his background in the Yellow Court sect and promise to take care of him. If that didn't work, he could threaten him. Since he came here, he must have lost his state of mind. A fly wouldn't bite a seamless egg. Since he had taken the step of selling himself, Zhu Cheng had plenty of ways to force him to submit. Chapter 720. Zhu Cheng's abode was located on Liège Mountain, one of the few scenic mountains in North Liangdao. On this day, a divine sense probing came from the foot of the mountain. This was a divine sense probing that belonged to Jindan. Zhu Cheng's heart trembled, and he instantly left the abode. With a few leaps, he was already outside the mountain. From afar, he saw a young Taoist smiling at him. "Your Qin Shou? That's me. Senior brother one invited me to meet you. It's a promise and also a final payment. It's better to settle the matter clearly." Zhu Cheng nodded and carefully sized him up. The necessary caution was still necessary. If he ran into the sect's fishing law enforcement, it would be troublesome. At 200 years old, Jindan's realm had already stabilized. It seemed like he had formed his core for several years. This was nothing new. It was normal for one to form their core within 10 years. "Where's your hometown? Who's your master? Where did you form your core? How many people know?" The young man stretched out his hand. "The final payment. After settling the debt, my hometown will be in North Liangdao, and you'll be my master. No one will know if I form my core at Liège Mountain." Zhu Cheng was still very stubborn. He had never thought of paying this sum. "Hold on. Do you know who I am? Do you know the power of my Zhu clan in Yellow Court Mountain? With such rudeness, aren't you afraid that things will be exposed and we'll both suffer? However, there's one thing you must know. If there's a punishment, I can take it, but a new disciple like you might not." The young man sighed. "I understand. You're going back on your word, and you're not willing to keep your promise?" Zhu Cheng shook his head. "Cultivators like us value promises the most. However, on the path of cultivation, some things are more important than resources. Since you've cultivated to this realm, I'm sure you understand these principles." The young man was disdainful. "I understand. However, I also understand what's real and what's fake. What's keeping a promise, and what's making excuses. If we don't get along, then it's too late to say anything. Since that's the case, I'll take my leave." Zhu Cheng moved to block the young man's path. He smiled maliciously. "Since you're here, do you still want to leave? You haven't even entered the sect, and you're already bearing the label of deceiving the sect. If I reveal even a little, you'll never be able to come into contact with the Golden Court's foundation." The young man was surprised. "Aren't you the same? How much better can he be than me?" Zhu Cheng laughed. "I have connections, and I've already learned a great technique. No matter how bad it is, I can still rely on breaking through to the upper realm to solve everything. What about you? Resources were only one aspect of cultivation. If you are willing to listen to me, I will introduce you to the Zhenren of the Zhu family." Isn't that more meaningful than some resources? There would come a day when resources would be used up, but maintaining a good network would be beneficial for a lifetime. Think it over carefully. The young man stood still, apparently weighing the pros and cons. He probably felt that he couldn't take this step in the end. The Chamber of Commerce had already received benefits, and the stain had already been placed, but couldn't be washed clean no matter what. "Fine. You and I both know what Senior Brother said. It's just an excuse. I just want Senior Brother to understand that one must always be honest when doing things. Time and time again, even a clay figurine has a clay character. Who knows if I, Qin Shou, won't soar in the sky one day." Zhu Cheng laughed. This was just another version of "don't bully a poor youth." "Don't worry. I don't want to make too many enemies in the sect. Having more friends was always better than having more enemies. In the future, when everyone is familiar with each other. We might even help each other out." The young man thought for a moment. "I can promise Senior Brother that I won't take the final payment, but I have a condition. If Senior Brother agrees, then everything will be as before. If not, then we'll go our separate ways and find our own paths." Zhu Chong was satisfied that his plan had succeeded. He asked, "What condition? Tell me about it." The young man revealed a yearning expression. Before coming, Master Li once said that Senior Brother Zhu's cultivation was profound, and his spells were unparalleled, especially the jade gold scissors, which was made of the highest grade known in the world, purple extreme gold. It can cut through all external objects. I am fond of external objects, and I like the way of refining them most. I don't dare to ask to be able to use it. I only hope to look at it from afar and be rewarded with the sharpest item in the world. That's enough, but in my heart. When Zhu Chong heard this, he didn't think it was too difficult. He had refined the jade gold scissors for dozens of years, and it had long become one with his mind. It couldn't be taken away by others. This was an offensive spiritual weapon. When used against an enemy, it had to be used against them. If he was afraid of losing it, then it was better not to refine it. It's a piece of cake. Watch carefully. With a flip of his hand, an item leapt into the air. The upper and lower edges of the scissors were still opening and closing, looking extremely fierce. The sharpness of the scissors could be felt from afar. It was truly worthy of being called the world's #1 metal. The young man gasped in amazement, dazzled by the sight. He said, "Senior Brother, I obtained a strange object. It's abnormally hard, but no one knows the origin of its material. Can you let the jade gold scissors try and see if it can cut through it?" Zhu Chong disdainfully said, "Strange object? It's just that you guys are ignorant and inexperienced. That's all. Fine, since Senior Brother is in a good mood today, I'll let you see what the world's #1 metal is." The young man apologized and took out a black iron plate from his ring. He tossed it into the air, and the jade gold scissors swooped down. The scissors opened and closed. In Zhu Chong's mind, this was a matter of cutting in half. Ever since he had refined the jade gold scissors, no other weapon could withstand his scissors. However, the strange thing was that the jade gold scissors, which had always been successful, turned pale with fright this time. The moment the upper and lower edges of the scissors approached the black object, they did not cut it, nor did they crack it. Instead, they mysteriously disappeared. The young man also found it strange. He waved his hand and took back the black object. After taking a closer look, he couldn't help but say angrily, "Senior Brother Zhu, you can't use a fake scissors to fool me, right? Where did the scissors go to? Senior Brother, you don't keep your word. I don't dare to make a deal with someone like you. It's better for me to leave." He turned and left. Only then did Zhu Chong realize that his jade gold scissors had been stolen. "Evil thief, give it back to me. Where do you think you're going? I, Zhu Chong, will fight you to the death today." One of them chased while the other fled. The young man fled swiftly and utterly didn't have the appearance of someone who had just refined the jade gold scissors. Only now did Zhu Chong understand that this person was probably a fake, and he'd been tricked. Who had the guts to deceive a Golden Hall realm cultivator's spirit weapon on the Golden Court continent? Even though he was furious, he chased further and further away. This person's movement technique was extremely strange. He passed through rivers and mountains, and after chasing for 50 kilometers, he'd already lost track of the young man, causing Zhu Chong to be angered to the point of shouting loudly. The jade gold scissors was the most precious treasure in his possession, and it could be said that just this one treasure had basically occupied 90% of his wealth. Even if his background was extraordinary, he was still unable to bear such a loss. Unfortunately, North Liang Dao was desolate, and there weren't any fellow disciples of the Golden Court sect within a few thousand kilometers of it. How could he possibly be able to chase after a cultivator whose speed far surpassed him? Most importantly, he had no way to tell this sort of extraordinary shame and humiliation to others. If he really told others, then not to mention being ridiculed by others, his clan would be dissatisfied with him, and a matter of him buying a quota would be exposed, causing countless troubles. Chapter 721. Lu Xiaoyi ran at lightning speed. His speed was already above Zhu Chong's, and with the help of the Earth Escape technique, he left Zhu Chong in the dust after a few turns. He sped up again. The route was already set, and the destination was very clear. Zhu Chong chased towards the south of the cold North Continent, because the fastest shortcut to leave the Yellow Court continent was in this direction, the man-made spatial fissure. If this swindler chose to fly out of the continent, to be honest, not to mention Zhu Chong, even a perfected cultivator wouldn't be able to stop him. The Yellow Court world was too big, almost 100,000 miles wide, with countless cultivators entering and exiting. There was no way to stop him, and it was impossible to set up such a large defensive formation. Therefore, he could only bet that this swindler would use the spatial fissure. He could go to the entrance of the spatial fissure in the Yellow Court Mountain, and he definitely wouldn't be able to stop him. However, he could ask the cultivator on duty for a list of the cultivators who entered and left the Yellow Court recently. He didn't have the right to investigate the whereabouts of the Yellow Court's own cultivators, but the swindler definitely wasn't from the Yellow Court. He only needed to know who had left the continent through the spatial fissure in the recent period after the swindler, and he would have a basic suspect group. However, Lu Xiaoyi was flying towards the north. There was no entrance to the spatial fissure in this direction, and he wasn't stupid enough to spend a few months traversing through the sea of clouds. The reason why he was flying towards this direction was because there was a section of the spatial fissure here. A more simple understanding of the spatial fissure was a bit like a human's broken leg. Due to various reasons, the blood vessels protruded from the surface of the skin. The Zhou upper realm had a long history, and it had been immersed in the path of spatial fissure for a long time. The spatial fissure passageways they established would often have slight variations due to the energy balance within the fissure being connected with a natural fissure due to the passage of time. This situation wouldn't affect the cultivators passing through, but the spatial fissure would no longer be hidden in the dimensional space, and part of it would be exposed to the main world. This situation wasn't rare. The spatial fissure passageway system that covered the entire Zhou upper realm would occasionally reveal a small section in each continent. However, the exposed spatial fissure couldn't be entered by cultivators and couldn't be exited from it because it was still in a sealed state in a practical sense. Take the space north of Liangbei Road as an example. It was about dozens of miles long and vaguely resembled a bulging blood vessel on a person's leg. It started from nowhere and then disappeared without affecting the normal operation of the space. This was the trump card that Lu Xiaoyi relied on to become a bandit in the upper realm of Zhou. He had once picked up a black iron plate in the chaos of the spatial rifts in the Land of Exile. It was used by the stowaways in the Land of Exile to create an extension of the spatial rifts. In the end, it was the item that pulled him into the rift. He had carefully studied this item during the year when he was traveling alone in the rift. The reason why he was interested in it at that time was because he wanted to obtain another method to enter and exit the rift other than the guidance of Providence. He knew nothing about spatial rifts, so he could only place his hopes on this foreign object that he had picked up. There was nothing he could do about it. After studying it for a while, he realized that this item only had the ability to pull oneself into the rift, just like what the stowaways did. However, it couldn't extend oneself out of the rift. It was a one-way, irreversible process. This made him very disappointed, and he slowly lost interest in it. It wasn't until he came to the upper realm of Zhou that he thought of this item when he wanted to rob the top 5 elements materials here. After the stowaways used this item once, its power was greatly reduced. It should be a semi-consumable item whose function gradually weakened. Its effect was very special, but unfortunately, it couldn't be used for a long time. He didn't know how many times he could use it. He held the idea that he could only use it once, and when it was finished. The jade gold scissors was the expansion function of this item. When there was an external force, it wouldn't compete with other items in terms of sharpness. It would directly bring it into its alternate space until its energy was exhausted. This time wouldn't be long, so Lu Xiaoyi had to leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, the space wouldn't be able to control this treasure. As soon as it returned to the main world, Zuchong would immediately react. Therefore, he turned around and ran. After getting rid of the victim's family, he went straight to the spatial rift. He wanted to safely release the treasure and completely refine it. Closely following the spatial rift, he took out the black iron plate again. As his magical power surged, the black iron plate penetrated into the two-dimensional space of the spatial rift. Following that, the rift expanded and wrapped Lu Xiaoyi in it. After a while, the expansion quickly disappeared, but the person who was wrapped in it didn't appear again. The ability of the black iron plate, when in the spatial rift of the land of exile, could expand the spatial rift to more than 100 miles. But now, it could only expand to less than 100 feet. But it didn't matter. For Lu Xiaoyi, who couldn't wait to hug the spatial rift, even if it only expanded to 10 feet, it would be enough to wrap around him. In the spatial rift, Lu Xiaoyi found that familiar feeling again. But now was not the time for him to relax. Beside him, there was still a pair of jade gold scissors rampaging. But even if it was extremely sharp and could cut through all material objects, it couldn't do anything to the illusory two-dimensional space barrier. The connection between the jade gold scissors and its master had been broken. Now, it was like a babbling child who couldn't find anyone to rely on. Every kind of weapon had a stage in the process of becoming a spirit, including swords, the nurturing stage, the familiarization stage, the instinctive stage, and the spiritual wisdom stage. The spiritual wisdom stage of a flying sword was the sword spirit, and the spiritual wisdom stage of a magic weapon was the weapon spirit. The material of the jade gold scissors was very high, but its shortcoming was that it had not been refined for long. Now it was still in the familiarization stage. The master could release it to fight enemies, and could also control it freely, but it had yet to develop its own consciousness. Its current collision was purely instinctive, relying on the residual consciousness of the master on the scissors. It only needed a certain amount of time before it would naturally dissipate and become a dead object. The length of time was determined by the strength of the master's spiritual power. So, the best way to deal with it was to constantly provoke it and let it attack on its own, increasing the consumption of the remaining spiritual power on the scissors. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have to worry about the scissors hurting him. Without the support of a cultivator's magical power, the scissors' attacks were as slow as a snail's. Under his provocation, the jade gold scissors vainly chased after the enemy, and its residual spiritual power rapidly decreased. In the end, it was caught by Lu Xiaoyi and became a completely dead object. It was good that it was a dead object. It would save him the endless trouble of refining it, and it wouldn't make him feel guilty for killing a living thing. It was very difficult for a living thing, especially a weapon that had developed spiritual wisdom, and it needed to be cherished. Fortunately, Zhu Chong didn't spend too much time on it, so it saved the robber a lot of psychological obstacles. It was also fate. Chapter 722. This wasn't the first person he'd made a move on after arriving at Golden Hall Continent. In fact, Zhu Chong was the third Golden Hall realm cultivator he'd found that possessed a first-grade material of the 5 elements. The first was that Lu Xiaoyi had smoothly found the person himself. In the end, after a battle, that fellow wasn't willing to use his natal spirit artifact, and even if death was imminent, that fellow would rather die than submit. This caused Lu Xiaoyi to be extremely depressed. He didn't know that this fellow had given the materials of the 5 elements to someone else. Or had he ruined the equipment refinement? Didn't he carry it with him? Or had he noticed his intentions? He was unable to use force in this matter because he couldn't expose his intentions prematurely and cause all the cultivators on the continent that possessed such treasures to be in danger, and it might even cause the interference of cultivators of a higher level. The second was that the timing he'd found wasn't right. Zhu Chong had a group of friends that were guests in the abode, and as soon as he made a move outside, a group of Jindan would surround him. If it wasn't for him running swiftly, it would really be difficult to say what would happen later. He'd come to be a bandit and not an assassin, and he belonged to the nature of playing around. The moment he saw the situation wasn't good, he'd immediately flee. It was precisely because he'd stayed in Golden Hall Continent for a long time that he'd coincidentally obtained some information about North Liang Dao from the Merchant Association system, and that was why he'd had this experience. The 2 times that he was relatively confident and had failed, yet this one that was ranked at the end had instead succeeded. The affairs of the world were difficult to predict, and it could be seen from this. It was impossible to fuse the materials within a spatial rift, as the environment here wasn't right. Moreover, there were always cultivators that passed by. The spatial rift he'd expanded into now was a man-made spatial rift created by a great cultivator from the Joseon dimension. Comparatively speaking, it was much more stable and had guidance. Since he was able to enter, then he would surely be able to leave. If it was a spatial rift formed by nature, then he wouldn't have the courage to use this method and enter rashly, and he might have to waste the rest of his life on the problem of how to leave. He didn't want to change to another continent as well, as there were a few tens of cultivators that had traded top-grade materials of the 5 elements in the Golden Hall continent in the last 100 years. Presently, he'd become familiar with this place with great difficulty and established a connection with some people in the Merchant Association, so he didn't want to give up so easily. In his opinion, his 3 attacks were very restrained and did not kill anyone. It was impossible for him to attract the entire continent to search for him. Since that was the case, why should he leave? If a spirit tool, like the golden jade scissors, was placed in a high-grade storage ring, it would basically prevent cultivators of the same cultivation level from probing it. Even Zhu Chong would not be able to peer into the ring through space. However, there was a problem here. The cultivators guarding the entrance and exit of the spatial rift were usually Yuanning immortals. If this Yuanning immortal was proficient in the spatial ability, then he would be able to sense the basic information in a cultivator's storage ring. In such a Yuanning immortal's perception, a top-grade item like the purple polarity gold would be very eye-catching, just like a firefly in the night sky. He had a more reliable method. He used a flying sword to coil around the golden jade scissors, and the formidable power of the spirit-imbued flying sword in the Tao realm of the 5 elements would be able to perfectly transform the aura of the purple polarity gold into the form of the 5 elements. Naturally, he would be able to hide it from the Yuanning immortal's perception. Lu Xiaoyi was bold because of his skill. He'd calculated the time, and even if that fellow Zhu Chong flew all the way to the exit of the spatial rift, he would absolutely not be faster than him passing through the spatial rift passageway. After all, the spatial rift passageway was built to shorten the journey, even if he wasted some time collecting the golden jade scissors. After the plan was set, he followed the instructions and quickly arrived at the exit of the spatial rift in the Golden Hall continent. When he stepped out of the spatial rift, the 2 Yuanning immortals were still guarding it. This time, he reported his real name, Single Ear, his real origin, carefree wandering, and his real purpose, to search for fortune in his travels. He was a cautious person. He'd used a fake identity the first time he entered, and if he used a fake identity the second time, it would be very difficult for him to hide from the attention of those who were observant. Never underestimate an upper realm cultivator. This was his principle of doing things. There was nothing to be suspicious about. Cultivators like him were as numerous as the hairs on an ox at the exit of the spatial rift. Those who came from the other divine mountains, those who came from the 3,000 unorthodox sects, and the cultivators from the Golden Hall continent had made this place the busiest port in the entire continent. Everything had a plan. Lu Xiaoyi had long since opened up an immortal's cave in a famous mountain that wasn't remote. The Dafa Immortal's Cave was set up with a simple spell formation that indicated the identity of the owner. In the upper realm of Joseon, it was very common for people to settle down with each other, as long as you didn't spread your Tao teachings in other people's territories, especially among the 9 great sects. The Golden Hall continent was almost 50,000 kilometers away, and no one was capable of thoroughly investigating every single immortal's cave and what every single cultivator was doing. Even immortals were unable to do so. Here, he'd use his magic energy to slowly refine the jade gold scissors, and with the assistance of the Jew City Sword Spirit, he'd refine the Violet Extreme Gold before fusing the Violet Extreme Gold into the Jew City Flying Sword. After this, a top-rate metal element flying sword would be completed. Not only was it peerlessly sharp, the metal element energy within it was pure. A flying sword like this was sufficient for him to use for a very long time, and even if he arrived at the Yuanian continent, it wouldn't fall behind. On the long path of cultivation, he didn't need to waste his mind and energy on the troublesome aspect of materials. This process took him a year. During this year, he'd frequently loitered around the surrounding human cities, and he'd even made acquaintances with the Golden Hall Realm cultivators that guarded this area. Everything he did was exactly the same as a normal traveling cultivator. On this day, the flying sword fused with the Violet Extreme Gold had attained mastery. With a command in his heart, the Jew City sword flew out from the top of his head. It possessed an extremely sharp quality, yet it didn't have a sword howl, and it pierced through mountains and struck rocks as if it was paper. At this moment, Lu Xiaoyi could be considered to have understood the sharpness of a metal element flying sword, and exactly how sharp it was. It was in the size of the sword tip. A treasured sword in the mortal world, a sword was a sword. No matter how sharp the sword tip was sharpened, when carefully measured and magnified, a value could still be obtained. A cultivator's flying sword had already broken away from the measurement of a sword as a whole. According to the understanding of physics from later generations, the sword tip had already attained the molecular level. In other words, so long as an obstacle had a gap that was larger than the molecular level, the flying sword would be able to pass through it. But molecules were divided into sizes as well. Different materials had different molecular structures formed from them. Amongst the metal element materials of the 5 elements, the Violet Extreme Gold had the smallest molecular structure, so before it, practically any object would be riddled with holes. So long as the molecules on the sword tip were able to enter, then relying on the cutting force supported by formidable magic energy and the extraordinary hardness of the Violet Extreme Gold molecules, breaking through the defense would be a matter of course. This was the first of his 5-element flying swords, and it was worth remembering. Cultivating the sword for over 300 years, he'd already gradually formed his own cognitive system in the sword Tao. As far as he was concerned, the Tao realm was divided into the real and the illusory. Perhaps on the innate grand Tao, there were even more illusory than real. Not to mention far away, just talking about his 5-element and star system, one was real and the other was illusory. For real, one naturally had to put effort into materials, such as his current pursuit towards the 5-element materials. For illusory, there was completely no need. What was important in the star system was the cultivator's utilization of the energy of the stars, and the flying sword didn't necessarily have to be stellar gold, sunstone, falling star, and so on. So, even if it was a 5-element flying sword, there shouldn't be any obstruction when executing the stellar sword formation. What was important was the person. Chapter 723. You're leaving? The Golden Court cultivator in charge of Jingji Dao was Lao Dan. He was a righteous person who had devoted himself to nurturing the next generation for a long time. His results were outstanding every year, but he did not have his own family. He was all alone and had the strength of an ancient cultivator. Lu Xiaoyi respected such a person. He was not particular about the person. Although he was here to be a bandit, it did not mean that he would not make friends with the Golden Court sect. In his opinion, when a sect's power was spread across such a vast area, the overall significance of the sect would be weakened to the minimum. Again, such a cultivation environment was very suitable for cultivating immortality, but it was not suitable for fighting for hegemony in the universe. What was cohesion? When one opened the window, one would see fellow disciples rushing past. When one walked out of the cave, one would be warmly invited by senior and junior brothers. When one ascended the pavilion, there would be great cultivators teaching. When one encountered trouble, both young and old would come together. In the upper realm of Zhou Xian, Jin Dan guarded each of them and had limited interactions. The friendship between gentlemen was as light as water. As the conversation went on, the words went out of one's mouth and the heart went out of one's heart. It's time to go. Although Mount Zhong is good, it's not my hometown. Where are you going? I don't know. I'll just go with the flow. Lu Xiaoyi did not have to report to Jin Dan, the guardian of the Golden Court sect. Greeting him was polite, and leaving without saying goodbye was unrestrained. However, those who had ulterior motives would generally behave more politely to prove their magnanimity and selflessness. I see. When I was young, I also traveled to various continents. Like you, I can't stay idle. I shouldn't stay idle either. If one day you want to stay in one place, it means that you're old. Lao Dan sighed. The two parted ways, one active and the other quiet. This was actually the process of communication between cultivators in the cultivation world. Lao Dan would not entrust anything to him, and Lu Xiaoyi would not discover any shocking secrets from Lao Dan. Plain and simple was the main tone in the cultivation world, just like the history of the upper realm of Zhou Xian. However, not every cultivator was like old Dan, who was willing to be ordinary and live a peaceful life. In the cultivation world, just like how there were still cultivators who cultivated their moral character in the 5 ring zones where there were fierce battles, in the upper realm of Zhou Xian, there was also a group of people who were unwilling to be lonely under the overall peaceful situation. Yellow Hall Mountain was an inconspicuous 3-story building, and there were cultivators frequently entering and leaving. This was the place that was the most lively in the Yellow Hall continent, and one could enter and leave according to one's interest. It was known as the small front court to the outside world, and it was a place in the entire Yellow Hall continent that was responsible for the safety of the continent, the maintenance of order, the maintenance of stability, and the suppression of dissidents. In fact, every continent had such a palace. It was just that it was not as conspicuous to outsiders. They were all great forces with a long history. On the surface, they looked like immortals and had a noble demeanor. However, this was just a facade. If any orthodoxy wanted to survive, there would definitely be a group of people who would do the dirty work. The scope of their attacks was also very wide. Theft, illegal immigration, murder, sexual sacrifice, evil cults, and so on. In an ancient world, there would definitely be no lack of ancient occupations. The more glorious it looked on the surface, the more dirty it was behind the scenes. This was the human race, and it was a matter of 2 sides of the same coin. Every day, countless news from all over the continent would be gathered and then divided into categories. There would be people in charge of sorting out the main and secondary matters and the degree of threat to the Yellow Hall continent. Then, they would use this to decide the countermeasures and the level of handling. Such a large continent had a terrifying amount of information. If it wasn't for the fact that the brains of cultivators were already different from ordinary people, they would probably be unable to handle such a large amount of work. The cultivators that were willing to come here were all cultivators that weren't willing to go to various parts of the continent to guard an area and nurture new people. They were cultivators that were more hot-blooded, had more pursuits, and were more willing to do some complicated and difficult dangerous work for the sect. Most of them were comparatively younger, filled with enthusiasm, and possessed strength that was comparatively more outstanding. Even if they wanted to do the dirty work, not everyone was able to do it. If they didn't have some ability, they were afraid that they would fall into a dirty pit and make a fool of themselves. The matters of the continent were decided by the Jin Dan, and this principle would not change. It was the same for the Yellow Hall continent, the same for Xiao Yao Yu, and the entire Zhou Xian upper realm. Even further, it was the same for the Blue Sky continent and the 5 Rings continent. It was a very normal choice. When cultivators were able to roam the void, who would still pay attention to such trivial matters in the upper realm? In a room on the 2nd floor, it was simple and exquisite. A figure sat facing the window. The scenery outside the window was picturesque, and the scenery inside the window was picturesque. Ina's curves and her long black hair was simply tied up. Just from looking at her back, it would arouse endless desire in people. They wanted to see just what kind of devastatingly beautiful woman she was. The woman was very busy, and this room was obviously not a private boudoir. Just the stone table that was a few feet wide showed the heavy tone of this place, and it seemed to be somewhat incompatible with the beauty beside the stone table. There were piles of jade slips on the stone table. Every time the woman picked up a jade slip, she would sweep it with her divine sense and make an initial judgment of the contents of the jade slip. After that, they would be placed into a simple rack at the side. Most of them would be classified as useless and would be destroyed after being stored for over a year. After all, these things actually took up a lot of space. A small portion of them would be classified as pending. In other words, they were temporarily unable to make an accurate judgment, and they would be stored for 10 years. The highest standard was handling an emergency, but in the Yellow Hall continent, it was rare for there to be a single emergency in a year. Instead, there were many matters that needed to be handled, and the cultivators below would be arranged to head to various places according to the priority. This was the information sorting center of the Yellow Hall continent. It received the reports, monthly reports, annual reports, or daily reports of sudden incidents from the various cultivators on guard in the entire Yellow Hall continent. All sorts of information of various sizes were gathered here, and the threat level was divided before appropriate decisions were made. What was something that the local cultivators on guard had the authority to deal with? What was something that the cultivators on guard in the Xianyuan continent carried out jointly? What was something that required the small vestibule to dispatch a specialized Jindan? Once a world had existed for a long time, its orthodoxy would be stable, and its rule would be unified, so there would naturally be a place like this. To the Jindan, it was indeed a principle to deal with its own troubles. But there were some troubles that didn't require the Yellow Hall Mountain to deal with for the personal affairs of the Jindan continent. How could such a large continent not have a place that coordinated the overall situation? But the Huangting Taoism wouldn't admit the existence of this place, even if it really did exist. So it only had a name, and the front mountain of the Yellow Hall Mountain was referred to as the Small Vestibule. Time silently flowed by, and the monotonous work didn't cause that beautiful figure to slack off in the slightest. Even if this kind of dullness wasn't something that every cultivator could endure, and it wasn't beneficial to their cultivation, but some people were different. A woman that was focused was also exceptionally beautiful. A delicate and charming head stuck out from behind the door. This was another kind of beauty, and there's only one word that could describe this face. Fairy. Big Sister Bing, let's go admire the flowers at the back of the mountain. Chapter 724. Seeing that the long-haired figure didn't respond, the female elf changed her method. Why don't we go to the immortal garden to feed the spiritual birds? I heard that Marshal Uncle Guan got a few mutant phoenixes from somewhere. Or we can go and pick some spiritual fruits. The plums in the herb garden are ripe. We won't be able to pick them if we're late. How about we invite a few people to practice spells in the sea of grass? I've learned a few new spells, but I don't know how powerful they are. I want to show them to you. The figure in front of the window sighed. She tilted her head slightly and said, Aya, why don't you tidy yourself up and come here to make trouble? Although it was only the side of her face, the beautiful scenery outside the window seemed to have lost its color in an instant. The woman's eyes were deeper than the deepest pool of water. Her eyebrows were light, but they were like splashes of ink on the horizon. Her skin was like snow, and her hair was black. Her smile and anger seemed to show the changes of the 4 seasons. Xia Bingji was the most outstanding figure among the Huangting Taoism's Kuan cultivators. Not only was she otherworldly beautiful, but she also had great strength and wisdom. More importantly, she had a Taoist heart that could withstand loneliness and serve the sect wholeheartedly. The heavenly Tao gave her the most beautiful things without holding anything back. Among the cultivators in the small front yard, countless cultivators came here purely for her. They didn't dare to profane her in the slightest. They just wanted to win her smile through their own efforts. Aya pouted. She was hundreds of years old, but she still acted like a little girl. She didn't know if she was really naive or pretending to be young. It was good that she had this mentality. It was better to pretend to be young than to pretend to be a robber. What's it to tidy up? It's all those trivial things every day. I'm so annoyed. It would be good if there was something important to do, but she just had to use these trivial things to fool us and shirk all her responsibilities. Inyu was also an outstanding Kuan cultivator in the Huangting Taoism, Jindan. She was excellent in all aspects. She might not be as good as Xia Bingji, the goddess of the Yellow Court, but she was at the top of the Kuan cultivators. She had a strong background, and her family was powerful. The Yin family's patriarch was a high-level true monarch, so she had been raised like a princess since she was young. However, she was also very capable. She had a strong family background, potential, and hard work. This made it impossible for others to live. Her complaint was not unreasonable. In fact, a precise and accurate system depended on the efforts of the entire system from top to bottom. The guarding monks had their own judgment and decisions. The small vestibule was carefully guarded, which was the best way to operate. Unfortunately, not everyone thought so. For the guarding monks who were released, because the Yellow Court sect had a stricter evaluation method, the punishment for those who did not report and deceive their superiors and subordinates was very severe. Therefore, the guarding monks slowly developed the habit of reporting everything to the sect, regardless of whether it was a big or small matter. Their responsibilities were completely shirked. The small vestibule's burden was getting heavier and heavier, and the number of people was increasing. It went from 12 people in the early days to hundreds of people now. Among them, 30% of them were not running around outside, but buried in the small vestibule's desk. The difference between this information work was that it was divided into preliminary and final selections. For example, Inya came to the small vestibule late. She was only temporarily curious and could only be assigned to the preliminary selections. Only people like Xia Bingji, who had been polished for a long time and really cared about the sex affairs, had the right to be the final selections. Of course, she couldn't sit here every day. There were a few final selections like her. Everyone changed every half a day. In the end, she couldn't delay the Jean Dan's cultivation because of these desk affairs. You just can't sit still and want to go out. Are you crazy? Why are you making up these excuses? Wait for me for another 2 hours. There are still some jade slips that I haven't finished reading. Moreover, there are some very interesting things in them. Although Inya was eccentric, she was also extremely intelligent. She had already realized something from her words. The reason why she came to the small vestibule was that her life was too dull and she wanted to find some excitement. What was excitement? Of course, going out with a sword was the most exciting. Compared to this kind of excitement, appreciating flowers, picking fruits, taming birds, and practicing magic completely lost their attraction. Sister Bing, what's so strange about it? Tell me. She hung her body on Xia Bingji's body. How did she look like a Jean Dan cultivator? This was only natural for a delicate princess like her to do it. If it was someone else, it would really make people feel disgusted. Xia Bingji didn't want to say it. Xia Bingji didn't want to say it at first. After all, it was just a guess without any solid evidence. She couldn't say it out loud to mislead others. Cultivators had to be especially careful when dealing with all kinds of information because there were countless coincidences in the cultivation world. If they used this as evidence and made an arbitrary judgment, who knows how many innocent people would be wronged. This was her responsibility, and she had never been careless. But this time was different. There was no fixed target, only the victim's family. There was no real body. It's like this. According to the information I received, amongst the countless vicious attacks that have occurred in the last 3 years, there are over 10 incidents that targeted the Golden Core Realm cultivators that were guarding our Golden Hall Realm cultivators. Most of them were able to find the culprit. Some have already been brought to justice. Some are still being pursued. And only 2 incidents occurred without rhyme or reason. One was at the Luo River Path. The cultivator guarding the Luo River Path, Mu Yang, was sneakily attacked. According to him, the opponent completely covered his face and disguised himself as a killer. After a fierce battle with him, he retreated. He also suffered light injuries. But according to our investigation afterwards, It's true that he suffered light injuries, but the so-called fierce battle was a bit exaggerated. In fact, he was beaten to a pulp, but the opponent didn't kill him in the end. It's very strange. Mu Yang is a cowardly person, and he's a good person. Throughout his life, he would look under his feet to see if there were ants under his feet. What enemy could he have? This is a suspicious case, and he was a bit careless. Doesn't this kind of thing happen every day? If we consider Foundation establishment, there will be hundreds and thousands of such unsolved cases. What's so strange about it? Xia Bingji smiled. You're right. I thought too much. I'll deal with some more jade slips. Aya, why don't you go and have fun first, and I'll come to you later? And you didn't want to, Sister Bingji? You're interrupting again. Are you bullying me for not being sensible? There's a second incident. Why don't you tell me the truth? Xia Bingji couldn't persuade her, so she could only say, the second incident happened to the Qi Wei path, senior brother Qianfan. You also know that senior brother Qianfan is good at making friends. He has always been a group of friends. However, 2 years ago, someone provoked him in front of his cave residence. As a result, his group of friends rushed forward and scared the person away. You're right. Senior brother Qianfan handles things fairly. Dafa has only heard that he has friends all over the continent, but I've never heard of any enemies. The origin of the person who attacked him is very strange. According to our investigation later, the speed of this person's escape technique is incomparable to that of their group. If it weren't for Qianfan's group of friends at that time, he's afraid that he wouldn't be that person's opponent. What made him feel strange was that the person was obviously stronger than him. If he really wanted to kill him, it's not like he didn't have a chance, but it seemed like he was deliberately beating the grass to scare the snake. Chapter 725. Seeing that Inya becomes serious, Xia Bingji frowned. The two incidents happened far away from each other and seemed to be isolated without any connection. However, if you think about it carefully, there are many similarities between them. Firstly, the people who were attacked were Jin Dan, the local guards. They were public figures and also came from our Golden Core continent. From this, it can be seen that the perpetrator is daring. Ordinary people wouldn't dare to attack Golden Court realm cultivators in our Golden Court continent. Secondly, they didn't cause any substantial damage. Mu Yang and Qianfan's strength were almost the same, and they both belonged to the core of the Golden Court sect. With the way this person dealt with Mu Yang, there was no reason for him to be so clumsy when he attacked Qianfan. His goal didn't seem to be to kill people, but something else. Thirdly, he hit his face in both attacks and didn't dare to show his true face. In the Zhou Xian upper realm, this kind of behavior wasn't strange. However, what this person did was that he didn't expose his true identity in both attacks. After communicating with the two victims, they had a strong feeling that this person seemed to be hiding something. Under the circumstances of being able to easily suppress a Golden Hall Golden Core cultivator without exposing his true Dao inheritance, what did this mean? This means that his strength might be beyond our imagination. However, Inya had a different opinion. Sister Bingji, you said that these two people were ambushed. When cultivators of our generation fight, ambushing first is very important. After living peacefully for a long time, we will lose our vigilance. Once we fall into a trap, it will be very difficult to turn the tables. I feel that we are scaring ourselves by thinking that this person's strength is extremely high, right? Many of the cultivators that our Golden Court sect sent to guard various places are not good at fighting, but mainly focused on education. It's not strange that they are at a disadvantage. If it was a cultivator from our small vestibule, do you think he could easily gain the upper hand, Sister Bingji? When Inya started to think, she was still very insightful. Xia Bingji nodded. Aya is right. We are all Jin Dan, but there is a huge difference in our strength. Just in terms of fighting, those who specialize in fighting and those who are knowledgeable in other techniques are not on the same level. Therefore, I put these two things aside for 2 or 3 years and still couldn't come up with an idea. But in the past few days, when I was talking to someone about the way of artifacts on the continent, I suddenly realized that I had missed a very important question. Inya laughed. Sister Bing, Your memory is really good. 2 to 3 years ago. New situations keep popping up every day. To think that you still remember. If it was me, I would have forgotten about it long ago. Anyway, no one died, so why keep thinking about it? Xiao Bingji smiled. I'm used to it. The Yellow Court continent looks peaceful on the surface, but there are actually countless ghosts in the dark. Speaking of artifacts, I suddenly realized that Mu Yang and Qian Fan had something in common. In the past 100 years, both of them had obtained top-grade materials of the 5 elements through their own wealth and the help of their sections. Then, they fused those materials into their own spirit artifacts. I was thinking, was this a pure coincidence? Or some kind of inevitability? As soon as Xia Bingji finished speaking, Enya fell into silence. Her eyes were blurred as if she had thought of something. Xia Bingji was very sensitive. She immediately realized that her sister might know something that she didn't know. Aya, I told you everything I know, but you didn't tell me what you got? Enya came back to her senses and hugged her arm. She said with a smile, I do know something, and it might be the key evidence. But Sister Bing has to agree to 2 conditions, otherwise I won't dare to say it. Xiao Bingji was helpless and could only agree. Just say it. Don't mention conditions. It's too estranged. Enya raised her fingers. The first condition is that because it involves privacy, I can't report it to the sect. Otherwise, they will say that I'm too talkative and will complain. Xiao Bingji nodded. When one's power grew, there would be all kinds of situations. Especially when it came to some powerful families in the sect, there would always be things that were hidden. Enya was a member of the circle of second-generation cultivators, so it wasn't strange that she knew some of the inner secrets of the sect. Enya continued, once it's confirmed that the small front court has the intention to attack, you must count me in. In any case, I'm a meritorious person. You can't just leave me aside and enjoy yourself. Xiao Bingji laughed. Nonsense. What's enjoying yourself? That's going out of the mountain to investigate and arrest people. It's hard and dangerous. Do you think it's like going on a field trip in the sect? All right, I promise you. If I'm the leader, I'll definitely bring you along. She didn't want to get involved in the family's dirty affairs. With her IQ and EQ, she knew that this puddle of water was too muddy. Once she got involved, she couldn't wash it away. She wasn't Enya, who had the support of a supreme elder. As for whether to bring this girl along or not, it would depend on the specific development of the situation. She might not necessarily be the one going out to carry out the mission. It still needed the joint approval of the senior Jean Dan members of the small front court. Enya was a little mysterious. She said with a smile, Sister Bing, you know that there are always some rumors circulating in the family. Some scandals can't be hidden. It's just that they usually don't spread it out. You know the Zhu family, right? They have a very strong crafting method sect. They have a very famous playboy in the Jean Dan level called Zhu Chong. Do you have any impression of him? He made a mistake decades ago and was demoted by the sect to guard Liangbei Road. He's been there for more than 20 years. Every year, he's scratching his head over the cultivation quota. This year is his 3rd decade. If he still can't cultivate a Jean Dan, you know the punishment of the sect. I'm afraid he'll have to guard Liangbei Road for another 30 years. The guards of our yellow courtyard are often suspected of secretly buying and selling disciples. The sect knows that this is a scandal, but they turn a blind eye to it. This Zhu Chong had no choice. His thoughts weren't right to begin with, so he naturally thought of this method. Thus, through the Chamber of Commerce, he bribed a new Jean Dan called Qin Shou to be the result of his 10 years of cultivation. But who knew that this Qin Shou would come to Liezhi Mountain a year ago and use some flowery words to trick Zhu Chong into taking out his natal spiritual artifact, the jade gold scissors, to show off to others. In the end, Qin Shou used some unknown method and took away the jade gold scissors. Then, he fled into the distance and disappeared without a trace. This matter was too embarrassing, so the Zhu family didn't report it to the sect. They could only keep their grievances to themselves and investigate in private. It seems that there hasn't been any results after a year. Sister Bing, don't you think this wastrel is funny? Xiao Bingji was very sharp. Yeah. Are you saying that the jade gold scissors also has a 1st grade 5 elements material? That so-called Qin show isn't the real Qin show? Inya laughed. It can't be hidden from Sister Bing. It's exactly so. The jade gold scissors has a large amount of extreme purple gold. It's the best metal element material in the world. It's the dream of every cultivator when it comes to refining spiritual artifacts. In the end, it's gone just like that. Qin Shou is a real person. He's currently in Yellow Courtyard Mountain. There's nothing wrong with him. He's a native of the mainland and is indeed a new Jin Dan. How would he have the guts to do this? The culprit is someone else. I'm afraid that the culprit found out about their deal and impersonated them to do something. When I heard Sister Bing mention those two unsolved cases, I was thinking, could it be the same person as Zhu Chong? Chapter 726. Xia Bingji was very cautious. They didn't fight, and you couldn't stop laughing. No, that idiot was tricked and mocked that his jade gold scissors didn't live up to its name. So he took out an item and asked him to cut it. That idiot really fell for it and used the jade gold scissors to cut it. In the end, he cut his own treasure away. There was no fight at all, but his speed was extremely fast. It seemed to belong to the 5 elements escape technique. There was no way to catch up. Xia Bingji was completely sure. She could also guess Zhu Chong's thoughts at that time. He probably wasn't really an idiot. As a Jin Dan, he should at least have a basic temperament. How could he be so easily tricked? He definitely had a request. Since he wanted someone to use his identity as a new disciple, how could he not agree to a small request? It could only be said that this deceiver had completely seen through Zhu Chong, so his actions hit the nail on the head. Then it's him. In the previous 2 incidents, the attacker also used the 5 elements escape technique. In the cultivation world, although the 5 elements escape technique is common, it's usually used as a supplementary escape technique. To truly grasp the essence of the 5 elements and make the 5 elements escape technique one's main escape technique, one needs to have a very high understanding of the 5 elements. Very few Jin Dan cultivators can do it. This also explains why this person went around stealing top-notch 5 elements materials. That's it. There's no mistake. Inyu was very excited. Then let's move out. Xia Bingji glared at her. This junior sister was sometimes extremely smart. For example, when she mentioned the previous 2 incidents, she immediately thought of Zhu Chong's encounter. Sometimes she was so childish that it was laughable. Move out? Move out to where? Who is this person? What's his origin? Appearance and characteristics? Whereabouts? Is it a group or an individual? Does he have any power or motive? We don't know anything. Inyu smiled bitterly. She also knew that she was too impatient. I'll go draw a portrait for him. I want to see who this person is. Drawing a portrait was also a term used in the cultivation world. It was a comprehensive sketch of a cultivator, including not only his appearance and characteristics, but also his spiritual aura, skills, spirit, and a series of other things. It was an overall description and deduction of the cultivator. Whether it was accurate or not depended on whether the information was comprehensive. In this aspect, Inyu was very talented. Thus, she made all kinds of preparations and gathered all kinds of information. One day later, Inyu was somewhat dejected as she held a jade slip. Sister Bing, there's too little information. Moreover, this person had appeared 3 times with different appearances and characteristics. Even the way his magic power was fluctuating was unpredictable. He must have planned this for a long time and deliberately did it. This portrait doesn't look alike at all. Xia Bingji also sighed. How could she not know this? He had also drawn it before, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get an accurate answer. In the world of cultivation, it was actually very difficult to track down the exact information of a murderer, if the murderer was deliberately hidden. But the more difficult it was, the more it aroused the persistence in her heart. Fortunately, nothing major had occurred recently, so she had plenty of time to arrange the search this time. So long as this fellow was still in Golden Hall Continent, then she would surely capture him. The continent was vast. Since they couldn't find him, they would lure him out. This matter had to be done as soon as possible. Otherwise, this person might have the possibility of leaving after he succeeded. If the scope was placed in the entire Zhou upper realm, then it was no different than looking for a needle in a haystack. It was basically impossible. She had made up her mind. She was also a senior Jean Dan in the small front courtyard, and she had the authority to make the decision. She looked at Enya and smiled sweetly. Aya, don't you want to participate in the search this time? I promise you, but I need to borrow something from you. Enya was very excited. Borrowing something wasn't a problem for her. This was also a common characteristic of cultivators from different backgrounds. Borrow what? As long as I have it. Even if I don't have it, I can help you borrow it, Sister Bing. She was the apple of Yin Clan's eye, and she had countless pursuers in Golden Hall Clan. Saying this really wasn't a boast. To a clan with a long history and deep resources like sex, there was nothing that could stump them in the path of artifacts. Xia Bingji shook her head and said with a smile, Why would I need to borrow it? Since I've asked, then it's naturally yours. Think about it. This person has repeatedly made a move for the 5 elements materials, and Golden Hall Continent is the continent with the most similar spirit treasures materials. He definitely wouldn't just take one material and leave. According to my inference, doing this kind of thing would require at least 2 or 3 harvests before he would give up and leave to another world. So my inference is that he'll definitely make another move in Golden Hall. We can't protect every cultivator that possesses a treasure. That would require a large amount of manpower, and how long would it take to protect them? Guardian Jean Dan wouldn't accept our protection out of pride, so he could only act in secret. This is completely impossible. Since it's like this, why don't we go along with his wishes and hold a treasure appraisal convention? With you, Aya, representing the Golden Hall clan, leading a wide range of cultivators that possess treasures to participate in the convention. And promise that all interested cultivators, regardless of whether they belong to Golden Hall or not, can come and participate. Enya's eyes lit up. She liked this kind of grand occasion. Lively enough, exciting enough, brilliant enough. She'd also changed from an assistant to a host. Being able to participate in this kind of treasure appraisal convention and seize the opportunity to capture the 5-element bandit was something that was worth boasting about for a long time. All right, my Yin clan will take the lead. I'll contact a few more clans and reveal all the treasures. Dazzle him until he's dizzy and covets the treasures. I'm not afraid that he won't take the bait. Xia Bingji stopped her. There are a few points that you have to pay attention to. First, the treasure appraisal convention shouldn't be too close to Golden Hall Mountain. Otherwise, that fellow might have a guilty conscience and might not dare to come. Put it further away so that he'll feel at ease. Second, don't inform the Yuanying martial uncles. This is a matter of us Jean Dan cultivators. Many of us are already giving a lot of face to a mere Jean Dan bandit by supporting him. Could it be that we're afraid that he'll make a move and run away? If that's really the case, then we don't deserve to possess these treasures. Moreover, we have to guard against the possibility of him not coming after smelling the Yuanying martial uncle's presence. We only have this one chance. Once he notices something, he'll definitely run far away. Where can we find him then? Third, in for a penny, in for a pound. Observing this person's actions, he's extremely cautious and cunning. Since Zhu Chong, Mu Yang, and Qianfan already have no treasures, then they shouldn't come. They've dealt with him before, and he's very cunning. He might not dare to make a move if he knows that someone familiar is present. All of this is to lure him out. As long as he's here, he won't be able to hide his tail. No matter how many people there are, don't tell me that we won't be able to discover him. Enya was extremely excited and also came up with an idea. I'll spread the news widely and do my best to make this convention known to everyone. Especially, we can't leave out the Chamber of Commerce. A lot of news is actually leaked from them. The layout of the convention procedures, the number of treasures, the hospitality of the guests, and so on will all be taken care of by me. I guarantee that it'll be the most successful convention in Golden Hall Continent. Xia Bingji sighed again. It hadn't even started, but the theme had already deviated. This was to capture someone, not to hold a convention. However, considering that these fellow cultivators have been bored for a long time and were looking forward to a convention that belonged to young cultivators, she couldn't say anything. The layout of the convention could be left to Aya, but she had to personally arrange the manpower. Chapter 7:27. Lu Xiaoyi flew towards his predetermined target. He intended to stop after finishing this robbery, as this was due to his respect towards the great powers that had existed for a long time. He couldn't take everyone to be idiots. 9 upper sects, 9 continents. Besides the unfettered Wander and Golden Court Palace, there were still 7 other places to choose from. There was no need to catch a sheep and drag it to its death. He who'd been in a bandit's lair for a long time knew when to be tight, when to relax, when to be greedy, and when to give up. The principle that the bandits of the Fifth Ring had always instilled in their juniors was that they had to take advantage of the situation when robbing. If they repeatedly encountered baffling obstructions, then it indicated that there was surely a reason behind it. Normally, one shouldn't try to be brave at this time, and it would be fine to change a place, time, and target. Lu Xiaoyi understood the essence of this extremely well. His robbing journey in the Golden Court continent didn't go smoothly. The first 2 failures were baffling, and if he failed the 3rd time as well, then he would immediately leave this place that was obviously ominous to him. But he'd succeeded the 3rd time, so he had to give it a try. Was this a chance success? Or did his luck change? He was similarly cautious towards this target of his, and he was even more cautious. He first observed the terrain nearby the target area, then found the nearest zigzag crack, and he only started to approach the target after confirming all sorts of things. In the Golden Court continent, the cultivators that guarded this place generally rarely left their own area. Occasionally, they could leave for a short period of time, but they weren't allowed to wander outside for a long period of time. So he wasn't too worried that he wouldn't be able to find a person. But before he'd even truly come into contact with this cultivator's abode, he'd already obtained a piece of news that made him feel extremely strange when he'd inquired about the recent major events in this area. The Golden Court Guard cultivator of this area had already left, and the reason was actually because he'd been invited to participate in some continent's 100-year treasure appraisal convention. His first reaction to such a coincidence at such a timing was that it wasn't targeted at him. It was called the Treasure Appraisal Convention, yet it was actually a trap. This was the most basic intuition and judgment of a cultivator. I wanted to pay a visit to Master here, yet who knew that it would be so unfortunate that I'd come all the way here for nothing? The shop owner smiled and said, "The Treasure Appraisal Assembly is scheduled for the beginning of next month and will last for more than a month. If fellow Taoist rushes there now, you will have more than enough time to arrive before the Treasure Appraisal Assembly begins." Wouldn't it be the best of both worlds if he could pay a visit to a sage and also appreciate treasures? I can't leave because I have business to attend to, otherwise I would definitely go. This kind of occasion is often accompanied by auctions. It is a great opportunity for my Shang family. If you don't want to travel, the local scenery is beautiful and there are many scenic spots and historical sites. Fellow Taoist, you can swim here one by one. Presumably, Master will be back in 3 months. That's also a good idea. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. He knew very well that if they were trying to lure him out, they would have to spend a lot of money. Otherwise, if they had no influence, the bandits might not be willing to patronize them. Moreover, he needed to figure out who was behind this if it was a trap. Could it be Zhu Chong? The Zhu clan was so powerful in the imperial court that they could set up such a trap all over the continent. All of this could be judged from the scale of the Treasure Appraisal Convention. After staying in the bandit's lair for a long time and experiencing life and death for a long time, he had a cautious and meticulous character. There were many things that he could see clearly as long as he was willing to use his brain. The journey isn't short and requires continuous flying for half a month. It's tiring and exhausting. If it's just some ordinary treasures, then it's better not to go. It's more comfortable to stay here and admire the scenery. The shopkeeper shook his head. Fellow Taoist, you don't know. The Treasure Appraisal Convention, this time, is extraordinary. The treasures displayed are the true treasures of the Jin Dan period. Ordinary things can't be brought to the table. in my imperial court continent. Because of tradition, there are many magic gatherings, but there aren't many treasure gatherings. Most of them are hosted by my Shang family. Our strength is limited. So how many things can we bring out that are attractive? But this time, it's led by the Imperial Court sect. It's truly continental in nature and involves a wide range of things. There are no precedents. The entire treasure appraisal convention is divided into a few parts. The medicinal pills part is all great medicinal pills and wondrous medicines. If they can't revive the dead and regrow bones, you would be embarrassed to put them up. Formations and talismans are part of it. They're all ancient and wondrous formations. Forbidden talismans and iron talismans are no different from medicinal pills. The main event is tool crafting. It represents the highest level of standard in the Imperial Court continent, especially in terms of materials. If they aren't of the highest quality, they can't be invited to participate. Alas, it's a pity that I can't go. But what's the use of going? I can only watch but can't do anything. Even if there are occasional auctions, with my wealth and strength, I won't be able to compete with others. It's good that I don't go. Otherwise, I won't be able to sleep and eat without thinking about it day and night. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Your way of thinking is wrong. If everyone thinks like you, no one will go. If you think like this, what if the heavens are looking after you and let you pick up a bargain? If a person has hope, there will be a day when it will come true. The shopkeeper handed over a jade slip. Take a look. This is the detailed list of treasures issued by the Treasure Appraisal Convention. It's not complete yet. I heard that there are more additions. Fellow Taoist is a sensible person. You'll know whether it's real or fake with a look. Lu Xiaoyi scanned it with his divine sense. He was very surprised when he saw the beginning. It's only at the Jin Dan level. Foundation establishment artifacts aren't worth mentioning, but if Yuaning artifacts aren't allowed to participate in the exhibition, it'll lose its interest, right? Moreover, why aren't Yuaning allowed to participate? Are they afraid of being robbed? The shopkeeper laughed. Fellow Taoist, you must be joking. In my imperial court continent, if there are still people who dare to fish in troubled waters in the treasure appraisal convention held by the imperial court people, then they don't want to live anymore. The reason why Yuaning aren't allowed to participate is because they're afraid that these seniors will rely on their wealth to make others unable to eat meat. Therefore, the reason why the Imperial Court sect's Taoist masters aren't coming is to warn the Taoist masters of the other continents not to cause trouble in the Imperial Court continent. This is a treasure appraisal convention that belongs exclusively to the Jin Dan cultivators. Foundation establishment Yuaning aren't welcomed. This kind of convention will also make the participating cultivators more relaxed. If not for a group of old monsters present, no one will be able to relax. So that's how it is. Lu Xiaoyi was even more certain that this convention was simply tailor-made for him. The smell of a conspiracy is so obvious. Is it because they've determined that he'll definitely go? His divine sense immersed into the jade slip and directly skipped over medicinal pills, talismans, and formations before placing his mind on the artifacts. Shockingly, there was a long list of spirit artifacts on it. There were almost 20 types of spirit artifacts, and all of them were top-rate spirit artifacts that had been refined in these past few years. There were metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, and they were all complete and varied, causing one to drool with desire. Inhumane, you're King provoking me. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't help but laugh in his heart. Truthfully speaking, he really wasn't a person that paid too much attention to external objects. Even if it was top-rate materials of the 5 elements, it was fine as long as they were sufficient. He'd never intentionally searched for them in the past 300-plus years. Now that he finally had some thoughts, someone had arranged such a large lineup to deal with him. Did they want to capture him and grind his bones to dust? Isn't it just some materials? Is there a need for this? Chapter 728. Lu Xiaoyi's decision to participate in the treasure appraisal meeting this time wasn't entirely because of his vindictiveness. His current disposition had long since passed the age of vindictiveness. The reason the Huangting Taoism had set up such a formation was obviously because they weren't able to confirm who exactly was the thief. He could be said to have been extremely careful and never been careless when he came to the Golden Hall continent this time. He didn't even reveal his true appearance, didn't use his flying sword, and the fluctuations of his dermic energy fluctuated indeterminately. He only used his true name when interacting with Golden Hall realm cultivators, and this was a must, because when he entered and exited the spatial rifts and passageways, it was impossible for his transformation to escape the perception of Taoist Yuanying. Moreover, he had to have a true and trustworthy identity when he was traveling around here. Since his true identity wasn't exposed, then why should he be afraid of participating in the treasure appraisal meeting? He would make a move, and it would be good to broaden his horizons. Yes, at the same time he decided to participate in the treasure appraisal meeting, he'd also decided that he would absolutely not make a move during the meeting, and he would be one of the countless cultivators that scrambled madly for treasures. Who could doubt him? A fellow Taoist that similarly came from the nine great sects? He just happened to be able to seize this opportunity to identify the owner of these treasures and what they were hiding. It would be much more convenient for him to make a move in the future, and he wouldn't have to endlessly buy information from the Merchant Association. Merchants valued profit greatly, and he hadn't caused any deaths now, so the merchants were still trustworthy. Once he exposed something big, the Merchant Association would surely be the first to sell information about him, and he was clearly aware of this. He'd gone this time for the sake of inspecting the treasures and for the sake of silently investigating those people that had set a trap for him. He'd surely make a move once more in the Golden Hall continent. He'd slap the faces of these natives. He'd seen it very clearly. The best opportunity was after the treasure appraisal meeting. Could these people that schemed against him protect these cultivators that possessed treasures for their entire lifetimes? At most, he'd go around the other continents and return 10+ years later to see if these people were still constantly thinking about him. This was the safest and most perfect response. Then now was the time for him to properly enjoy and satisfy his craving. After making a decision, his mood relaxed. He suddenly noticed that the feeling of being a thief was completely different from purely being a spectator, and this was relaxing from the inside out. I'm still not a true thief. When did it become more natural to be a great thief than a spectator? That was the true realm of a fifth ring cultivator. Jingji Dao was a bustling place, yet it was far away from Yellow Court Mountain. Such a choice of venue was slightly baffling in the eyes of those who didn't know the truth, but Lu Xiaoyi knew that this was only a method to let down his guard. He traveled all the way to the east and passed through several prefectures. In less than a month, he'd already arrived at the capital. This was the most flourishing prefecture in the Golden Hall continent, and it was truly his first time here. His mood was relaxed, and he did things in a carefree manner. He ate and played as he pleased, and he even inquired about the specific location of the treasure appraisal convention from the people of the Dafa. His performance was just like a true traveling cultivator from the outer lands. Actually, there was no need to ask too much. When he arrived at Jingji Dao, most of the flying traces of the cultivators in the sky pointed to one place, and that was definitely the location of the treasure appraisal meeting. Guangqing Palace was a side palace of the Huangting Taoism in Jingji Dao. It wasn't a place for cultivators, and it was purely a place for the Huangting Taoism to show kindness to the mortals. Such palaces could be found almost all over the continent. They varied in size, but their purpose was the same. The Taoists of Guangqing Palace had been transferred to other Tao palaces half a month before the treasure appraisal meeting. The completely vacated Tao palaces were completely occupied by Yellow Court sect cultivators. A portion of them were Foundation Establishment cultivators who didn't know the truth, and a portion of them were law enforcement cultivators from the small vestibule of Yellow Court Mountain. They were in charge of the security of the entire Guangqing Palace. In the same realm, if a cultivator ran away, 10 cultivators wouldn't be able to catch up to him. It was precisely because they knew that the great thief's escape technique was powerful that the law enforcement cultivators of the small vestibule were not careless at all. They didn't put on airs either. Indeed, Taoist Yuanying didn't come, but a large group of Jin Dan cultivators from the small vestibule had come. In addition to the various Jin Dan cultivators who presented their treasures, there were more than 200 of them in total. It was a force to be feared. Xia Bingji stood on the roof of Guangqing Palace and looked down. There were cultivators going in and out continuously, and they seemed to be setting up something. She was one of the people in charge of this treasure appraisal meeting. There was another person who stood side by side with her. He was a handsome, and divine male cultivator who had entered the small vestibule earlier than her. He was also Inya's elder brother from the same clan. He had the highest combat strength among the younger generation, and he was also one of the people who had the most hope of becoming the Yuanying. There were a few other cultivators standing behind them, including Inya, who arranged the flowers, colored draperies, furniture, and other insignificant things in the entire venue. However, she was completely unrelated to the core security of the entire venue. She was very unhappy because she had a lot of good ideas that weren't carried out. Actually, in her opinion, capturing a mere 5-element bandit was only a small matter. It was something she could do along the way. With so many Jin Dan cultivators here, why would she need to arrange anything? Even if they used numbers, they could crush him to death. The key was the treasure appraisal meeting. There hadn't been such a meeting in the Golden Court continent for a few hundred years. In her opinion, if the capture was successful and the meeting failed, it would be an even greater failure. If the capture failed and the meeting succeeded, it could be considered a perfect success. The meat was rotting in the pot, and the reputation was stinky at home. How could the loss of a mere Zhu Chong offset the views of the entire continent, including the countless cultivators from outside the continent towards the Golden Court continent? However, her companions didn't think this way. They attached more importance to the capture of the 5-element bandit and rejected many of her groundbreaking ideas because of this. This made her very unhappy, but there was nothing she could do. As the saying goes, the words of a lowly person carry little weight. With her status, she could mess around and act coquettishly, but she couldn't make decisions when it came to important matters. The problem now was that the two leaders were arguing about the tactical arrangements. They each had their own opinions and didn't give in to each other. Xia Bingji spoke softly, but her tone was very firm. Deploy troops to the Guangqing Palace and try to capture him in one fell swoop. It will definitely cause a disturbance, but if we explain it properly, it will instead increase the prestige of our Huangting Taoism on the continent. This person's 5-element escape technique is strange and profound. Although there are a few experts in the 5-element escape technique among us, no one knows what will happen when the time comes. We can arrange a small number of people outside. In an open area, if a cultivator with profound escape technique wants to escape, there isn't much difference between 2 or 3 people and 10 people surrounding him. Therefore, my opinion is to maintain our prestige in the Guangqing Palace. We don't need to be afraid of chaos. We need to capture him quickly and not give him a chance to escape out of the palace. In fact, Xia Bingji was also very helpless. Her idea was very good, but she didn't expect that when it was implemented, it would change from a small-scale treasure appraisal conference to a meeting on the continent. This pair of siblings from the Yin clan achieved the same goal by different means and created a great momentum. In fact, it was also because of the internal strife, alliance, competition, and so on within the Huangting Taoism. However, she still placed her hopes on this treasure appraisal conference because this bandit didn't hurt anyone. If he didn't hurt anyone, he had a bottom line and pride. Even if he knew it was a trap, he would still come and take a look. Although it was very likely that he didn't want to make a move, she believed in her intuition. As long as this person appeared, she would definitely be able to find him. Chapter 729. Mr. Een looked at her gently. She was the goddess he had been pursuing for hundreds of years. Although he had not seen any hope of success, he believed that the Huangting goddess would definitely be his. He had no way of dealing with his sweetheart, but he had many ways of dealing with other pursuers. Firstly, he had overwhelming strength, and secondly, he had a proud family background. Many of his fellow disciples had run into a wall with him and had nothing to say. They could only work hard in secret, hoping that they could wait until the goddess was married. His sweetheart did not blame him for his actions, but he knew that it was not a tacit agreement. She also had no feelings for others. He was already very satisfied. Although he did not win the heart of his sweetheart, at least he did not let her fall into the arms of others. As long as he persevered, time was on his side. Sooner or later, he would get what he wanted. But feelings were feelings, and cultivation was cultivation. He was very clear on this point. As far as he was concerned, it was precisely this attitude of his that allowed him to retain the last trace of hope of marrying the divine maiden. If he was like those ordinary people, obedient in every way, without a backbone, and lost himself, then he wouldn't even have this last trace of hope. Xia Bingji came from an ordinary background, but she had a good master. She was also famous in Huangting Taoism. This made all those who wanted to rely on power to force her to submit to them end up badly beaten. He did not want to do so, and he might not be able to do it even if he wanted to. Therefore, when he had different opinions, he would never give up just because he was facing the goddess he was pursuing. Instead, he would be even more persistent. Sister Bing, do you know how many Jean Dan will come to our treasure appraisal convention? From what I know, it will not be lower than 800. It far exceeds the scale of our 200 Golden Core realm cultivators. Among them, there are many true elites from other sections. Just based on strength, they are not much weaker than us. Not to mention, there are some who are not on good terms with the Huangting Taoism. Yes, they are unable to work together, but they may only need one chaos to damage the reputation of our Huangting Taoism. In addition, there are those from Little Lu who act lawlessly, have evil intentions, and want to see the world in chaos. If it really gets chaotic, how can we control such a small place? Therefore, my intention is not to act rashly in Guangqing Palace unless I have absolute confidence. We have many ways to solve the problem of tracking, and we can tamper with the spirit artifacts. We also have many senior and junior brothers who are good at tracking. If we deploy our forces outside and leave only a small number of people in the palace, he will be tempted to make a move. So what if he was fast? Can it be faster than our secret winged tip shuttle? By doing so, not only would he be able to capture the bandits, he would also be able to successfully hold the treasure appraisal convention. Wasn't this the best of both worlds? I know that you must be thinking that I didn't want to destroy the treasure appraisal assembly for the sake of my family's reputation. However, I can responsibly say that in my heart, capturing the 5 Elements bandit is the most important thing. According to the rules of Huangting Taoism, the two of them could not come to an agreement. The result was unexpected. There were more people who supported Mr. Yin. Even though Xia Bingji had more admirers, everyone seemed to have learned from Mr. Yin's trick. Being blunt to the goddess might attract her attention. Relax the defense of Guangqing Palace. Relax on the outside and tighten on the inside. In principle, all the treasures should be handed over to their respective owners. They are also the most familiar with their treasures. No one can replace them. Leave the Huangting secret seal on all the treasures so that we can track him. Our main blockade zone is 10 miles away from the palace. If it's too far away, we won't be able to concentrate our forces. This person is good at the 5 elements, and his earth escape is definitely not bad. We have to bury sensing spirit artifacts under the ground outside the palace. Senior and junior brothers who are proficient in the 5 elements escape are on standby. Since we are holding the treasure appraisal convention, we have to be more dafa. With so many cultivators guarding the treasures, no one will say that our Huangting sect is stingy. I will personally ride the wingtip shuttle to patrol the outside. I don't believe that this person can escape from my grasp. The cultivators in the small front court hall all agreed. To be honest, Goddess Xia Bingji's strategy was a little risky. It was not as comprehensive as Yin Xiangzhong's suggestion. Furthermore, Huangting Taoism was originally a moderate orthodoxy. They did not like to take risks and were more used to doing things step by step in an orderly manner. Close to 1,000 Jindan cultivators were squeezed in the small Guanqing Palace. Once they exploded, the consequences would be unimaginable. After giving his instructions, Yin Xiangzhong looked gently at his sweetheart. "Junior sister, do you have anything else to add?" Xiao Bingji's expression did not change. In the Huangting sect, such moderation was already deeply ingrained in their bones. She could not change it, but she still had her last bit of persistence. "I will be in charge of receiving guests in the Guanqing Palace. I need a few people. Aya, Qingqing, Hongya. We will record the information of every cultivator who comes and see if we can find traces of this person in the preliminary analysis." Master Yi nodded. Of course, he would not refuse. "All right. Junior sister Bingji's ability is unmistakable. Who in the Huangting sect doesn't know about it? However, aren't the few of you a little too few? I will send a few more experts to assist you. If anything happens, we will be able to deal with it well." Enya immediately expressed her dissatisfaction. "Ninth brother, aren't you looking down on people too much? Are you looking down on women? When I fought with you 2 years ago, you lost to me by half a move." Master Yin ignored her. What was the point of such a method? Not to mention him, even a perfected ancestor lost to her by half a move. What was the point? He only stared at his sweetheart. However, he saw Xiao Bingji's eyes turn, and she did not retreat at all. "I seem to have lost to you by half a move, too." Master Yi knew what she meant. This half a move was the real deal. Xiao Yubing's strength was second only to his in the Huangting Taoism's Jindan group. He should not doubt her ability. The plan had been set. Everyone went their own way. Now, the main direction was placed on the periphery, giving the Guanqing Palace a relatively relaxed environment. This was a kind of encouragement for the bandits, a kind of magnanimity for the participating cultivators, and a face that must be maintained for the master of the continent, the Huangting Taoism. They could not be like small families. When others came to see their things, they would stare so hard that their eyeballs would pop out and not move an inch. That was too petty. Large factions could not afford to lose face like this. Several days in advance, cultivators began to enter the venue. The Golden Court realm cultivators set up a simple semicircular formation in the Guanqing Palace. It was like a large bowl that covered the Guanqing Palace. The purpose of this formation was not to prevent people from entering or leaving, but to tell the guests in disguise where the entrance to the venue was. Of course, you could also charge in, but if you did that, you wouldn't be admiring the treasures, but looking for trouble. At the entrance to the venue, a few charming Kuan cultivators were waiting to welcome them. Some of their impatience disappeared without a trace in the beauty of the Kuan cultivators. No one expected that the Huangting sect, which had always been known for being old-fashioned, would actually do something like this. They did not see any treasures, but they first saw a few peerless treasures. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.